Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I still remember the first night I heard the footsteps. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning and I was in my small office. Near the back corridor on the ground floor, the building was dead quiet except for the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. Then out of nowhere I heard a set of footsteps on the floor above me. They weren't slow and they weren't fast, but they had a steady rhythm. I felt my spine tighten and my breathing got shallow. I just sat there listening, trying to figure out if I was imagining things, but the steps kept going for about half a minute before fading away. I checked the security monitors right afterward, but there was nothing except static. That was the beginning of everything. My name is Alex and I've been the night caretaker in this old commercial building for about 2 years. It's a place that used to be busy during the day with offices and small businesses, but most of the tenants left when the owner raised the rent last year. Now only a handful of offices still operate here, and most of those close around 6 o'clock or 7 in the evening. By midnight the entire place is empty except for me and maybe a couple of late working people in the shared workspace on the second floor, but they usually leave by 10 or 11. After that I'm completely on my own. I don't usually feel lonely. I'm not a social guy. My shift starts at 9 p.m. and ends at 5 a.m. I follow a simple routine. I walk around to check each floor, make sure the doors are locked, make sure no homeless person slipped inside, that kind of thing. I have a small desk in an office behind the main lobby where I keep an eye on the security cameras. I used to spend most nights flipping through phone apps or reading random articles online, but ever since I started hearing these footsteps I've been on edge. The second night it happened, it was maybe 12:30 a.m. I had just finished my second patrol of the building. I grabbed a coffee from the vending machine in the lobby and walked back to my office. A few minutes later I heard those footsteps again. They sounded like they were coming from the third floor. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I put down my coffee, stood up and made my way upstairs with my flashlight. Each step I took felt heavier than usual. My heart was pounding and I was breathing a little faster than normal. When I reached the third floor I didn't see anyone. The corridor was empty. I used my flashlight to check all the corners, even looked inside the restrooms, but I found nothing. The floor was completely silent. I walked back to my office and rewound the security footage, but all the cameras on the third floor showed static during the time I heard the footsteps. Every other camera on the other floors was perfectly clear. That was the first time I realized something strange was going on with the feed. Over the next few nights the footsteps grew more frequent. They always came after midnight, sometimes around 12:15, sometimes around 1 a.m. Sometimes they sounded distant, like they were at the far end of the corridor on the top floor. Other times they seemed so close that I expected to see someone walk past my door. Each time I ran to check the area, but it was always empty. The cameras kept showing static whenever the sounds occurred. I tried to tell myself that maybe there was some electrical interference, or maybe the old pipes were making those noises. I knew that old buildings can creak and groan at night, but these weren't random creaks. They were actual footsteps, one after the other with a steady pace. I started to notice that the footsteps would follow a pattern: walk for a few seconds, pause, walk for a few more seconds, pause. Again, it was like someone was patrolling the hallways the same way I did. After about a week, I started losing sleep during the day. I'd lie in bed picturing those empty corridors and the sound of steps echoing through them. My boss didn't believe me when I told him. He thought I was just working too many hours, so I stopped telling him about it. I decided I'd figure it out on my own. One night I set up my phone to record on the third floor while I listened for the footsteps. I wanted some proof that I wasn't going crazy. I placed my phone near the center of the corridor, hit record and left it there. Then I went back downstairs and waited. Around 1 a.m. I heard the footsteps again. They were right above me on the third floor. I waited until they stopped, then I rushed upstairs to collect my phone, but when I played back the video, the screen was just black after 30 seconds and the audio turned into a high-pitched whine. Right at the moment the footsteps started, I felt my stomach clench. I had no idea how that could happen. The phone was fine before I set it up. The battery was charged, the memory was far from full, but the file got corrupted in the exact time frame I needed. A few nights after that, I decided to confront whatever was making the noise. At around midnight, I started walking the corridors the same way I always did, but I stopped in certain places to listen closely. I wanted to see if the footsteps would begin while I was already on the same floor. Nothing happened at first, so I kept moving. I reached the second floor and stood near the elevator waiting. Then I heard footsteps on the third floor. I bolted up the stairs as fast as I could and burst into the third floor corridor. The footsteps stopped. I felt my muscles tense. My flashlight beam shook a little because my hands were trembling. I checked every corner, empty. I felt a wave of nausea. My legs were weak. I forced myself to breathe slowly and calm down. I walked over to the windows at the end of the corridor. I pressed my hand against the cold glass outside. The street was dark. The only light came from the flickering street lamp. Cars passed by every now and then, but that gave me no comfort. I turned around and looked back down the corridor. Everything was still. I decided to head back to my office. On my way down the stairs, I thought about the pattern of the footsteps. I realized they seemed to match the route I took during my rounds. First floor, second floor, third floor. I always start at the top and work my way down, or sometimes start at the bottom and work my way up. These footsteps also moved in a sequence from floor to floor, but not always the same direction as me. I started to suspect that they were copying me in some way, following the same schedule, but offset by a few minutes. As the nights passed, I noticed the footsteps were getting closer to my office. At first they stayed mostly on the upper floors, then they moved down to the second floor right above my office. Eventually I could hear them in the corridor leading to my door. By the time they reached the ground floor hallway, I felt on the verge of panic. Every time I heard them, I'd sit there, heart pounding, staring at the door handle, expecting it to turn. It never did, but the footsteps would stop right outside, like someone was standing there. One evening I decided to film the camera monitors with my phone to see if I could catch them changing to static at the exact moment the footsteps sounded. Around 12:45 a.m. I heard the steps on the ground floor. I pointed my phone at the monitor, which showed the hallway just outside my office. The image flickered, then turned to gray static. Meanwhile, the footsteps grew louder, and I couldn't see anything on the screen. Then the footsteps stopped. The static cleared a second later, revealing an empty hallway. I replayed the video. The footage showed the hallway one moment, then static, then the hallway again. The audio captured the footsteps, but it was so distorted that it almost sounded like a glitch. I saved that file, but it didn't help me understand what was happening. After a few weeks of this, I started to dread coming to work. My boss noticed I seemed jumpy, but I told him it was just stress. He offered to switch me to a day shift, but that would have meant a pay cut and I needed the money, so I stayed on nights. I started to keep the radio on in my office to have some background noise. It helped a bit, but not much. I'd still hear the footsteps whenever they started because they were so distinct. One night I was walking the corridors earlier than usual, around 10:30 p.m, hoping I could wrap up my rounds and then stay locked in my office until morning. I moved from the first floor to the second, then to the third, checking each office and door. While I was checking a supply closet on the second floor, I had a sudden thought. I realized that the footsteps always matched the path I took in the previous night's routine. I decided to test that, so I varied my route. I went to the fourth floor first, then down to the first floor, then up to the third, then the second. It was a random order, not my usual pattern. Sure enough, the next night I heard the footsteps start on the fourth floor, then moved to the first, then to the third, then second. That's when I understood that whatever this was, it was copying my exact routes, but doing it during the following night. I felt my heart beat faster when I made that connection. The realization felt heavy in my chest. There was no reasonable explanation for that. It made me question everything. But I tried to stay calm. After discovering this pattern, I started to plan my patrols more strategically. I set up small markers in certain places, like a trash can slightly moved away from the wall or a piece of tape on the floor, just to see if anything else happened. Sometimes the markers were moved back to their original spots, but I never caught anyone doing it. The cameras were no help. They always showed static during the times the footsteps were heard. On one particularly tense night around 1 a.m. I heard the steps coming down the third floor hallway. They moved right above me in the second floor corridor. Then I heard them on the stairs heading toward the ground floor. I stood next to my office door with my flashlight turned off, keeping myself as quiet as possible. My heart was racing and I could feel my pulse in my temples. The footsteps reached the end of the hallway. They stopped for a few seconds. I stopped breathing, then they resumed, heading back toward the stairs. I felt a surge of relief, but it was mixed with a weird kind of dread. I grabbed my keys, locked the office door, and followed. I kept some distance because I was scared to confront whatever it was. My hands were sweating. My body felt tense all over. I could hear my own shoes scuff the floor as I tried to move quietly. The footsteps moved to the second floor again, and I followed up the stairs. Right when I reached the landing, the footsteps stopped. I looked around the corridor. It was empty. I stood there for a minute, breathing heavily. Then I slowly checked each office. Nothing was out of place, but I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on my arms stood up. Eventually, I returned to my office and sat in my chair. I stared at the monitors, which were all clear. I listened for more footsteps, but I heard nothing. The rest of the night was quiet. I spent that time trying to figure out why this was happening. The only conclusion I kept coming back to was that some presence was mirroring my own roots and footsteps, but I didn't know why or how. I felt a deep unease that I couldn't shake. By the next week I was barely functioning. I tried everything, checking the electric system, the ventilation, the old floorboards. I never found a normal explanation. I even asked the remaining tenants if they'd ever heard anything weird at night. A couple of them said they heard noises, but they assumed it was me doing my rounds. Nobody else seemed to care. That made me feel even more alone in this situation. The final straw happened when I was patrolling the second floor around midnight. I was listening carefully, waiting for any sign of those footsteps. Then I heard them start on the first floor, but instead of the usual slow pace, they came faster heading up the stairs. I stood there in the corridor, gripping my flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt. The footsteps reached the second floor landing and paused. I backed up slowly, my breath shaking. Then I heard them move toward me step by step. They matched the exact pace I use when I walked through that hallway. My chest felt tight. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears. I turned around and rushed to the stairwell that leads back down. I raced to my office, locked the door, and watched the camera feed. Static replaced the corridor camera. When it cleared, nothing was there. But I heard the footsteps right outside my office door. My hands were trembling so much that I dropped my flashlight. I bent down, picked it up, and turned it on. Then the footsteps moved away. That was it. They just left. Now every night I wait for the footsteps to begin. I track them. I mark down the times, and I watch the cameras glitch out each time. I don't know what else to do. There's never anyone visible, yet the footsteps follow my path from the day before. They always come closer, and I still don't understand how or why. I just know that when midnight rolls around, I'm on edge, listening for every small sound. That's my life now. I keep doing my job because I need the paycheck, but I can't shake the feeling that something is walking with me in this building, retracing my steps, echoing my routine. And no matter how many nights pass, I can't find a logical explanation. All I can do is keep listening, keep recording, and keep trying not to panic. Every time I hear my own footsteps echo in an empty hallway, I want to start by saying I've spent years taking photos of abandoned buildings. I've walked through empty factories with ceilings ready to collapse and rotted wooden floors that creaked under my boots. I've climbed towers with broken stairs and risked losing a leg more times than I can count, but none of that ever spooked me the way an old mansion outside town did. I want to be very direct about this. I'm used to dark hallways, strange sounds, and dusty corridors, but I never saw reflections of people in my shots when there was no one else around. That's what happened this time, and it made my skin crawl in a way I've never experienced before. I remember the first time I heard about this place. A friend mentioned it in passing. He said there was a decrepit mansion near the edge of an overgrown field about 20 miles from the city. He had no interest in it, but I felt a spark of curiosity. It wasn't on any map. I decided to check it out for my portfolio of old architecture. I drove there on a Friday. It was late in the afternoon and the sky was grey. The house looked large from a distance. The trees surrounding it were tall and their branches were twisted. The grass and weeds were waist high and I had to push my way through. My shoes got soaked from the dampness. The mansion itself was 2 stories tall, made of old stone with a few windows missing. The wood on the porch looked warped. The paint around the windows was peeled and flaking. I could see a broken gutter hanging from the roof. All of this was normal for an abandoned property. I felt that usual rush of excitement. My camera bag felt heavier on my shoulder than normal, probably because the air felt thick. I wasn't scared at that point, just eager to start shooting. I set up my tripod in front of the mansion. I wanted to capture the entire facade. I took a few wide-angle shots, tested different exposures. I use a high-resolution camera, so I'm used to picking up tiny details. I didn't see anything odd at the time. A few crows were perched on the roof and they made soft croaking sounds. The front door was slightly ajar and the hinges looked rusty. I snapped photos of everything. I walked around the porch, checked out the windows, but I couldn't see inside very well because the interior was dark. The glass on some windows was cracked. I felt a light breeze on my neck. I heard rustling in the overgrown bushes. It might have been a rodent or something that's normal in these places. After about an hour of external shots, I decided to Try going inside. The front door opened with a creak. I stepped in and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was musty like wet wood and old carpet. The foyer was covered in dust. I could see footprints in the dust, but they seemed old. They weren't mine. I've seen footprints in empty buildings before, so it didn't strike me as strange at the time. People sneak into these places. Sometimes they sleep there or they're just exploring. I walked slowly, shining a flashlight around. The walls had peeling wallpaper and the floors had some deep cracks. I took a couple of shots with the flash on. I made my way into a living room. There was a large fireplace full of soot and an old couch with torn fabric. I took some more shots. Every now and then I heard a soft tapping coming from somewhere upstairs. It could have been loose shutters or something brushing against the walls. I've learned to tune out random noises in abandoned places, but something about this tapping felt rhythmic. I paused a few times to see if I could figure out where it was coming from. It stopped when I stopped, then started again whenever I moved. It made my nerves tingle, but I tried to ignore it. I walked upstairs carefully. The banister felt unsteady under my hand. The second floor hallway was narrow and most of the doors were closed. I tried opening one, but it was stuck. I took a photo of the hallway with the flash. I saw bits of dust swirling in the air. The tapping continued somewhere behind the walls. I decided it wasn't worth forcing the doors. I took a few more shots of the hallway, then I headed back down. I felt uneasy. By then my shoulders were tense. I just wanted to wrap up. I took some pictures of the porch from inside and then I left. I drove home, loaded my photos onto my computer and started reviewing them. The outside shots looked crisp. I zoomed in to check the stone details. That's when I saw something that made me recoil in my chair. In one of the windows on the top floor I could see a faint reflection of a face. It wasn't my reflection. I know how to spot my own shape when I'm taking a shot. This was someone else. I leaned in, bringing my face closer to the screen. It looked like a middle-aged woman's face. Her eyes seemed to be looking directly into the camera. I felt a jolt in my gut. I scrolled through a few more shots, and in another photo I saw a partial reflection of the same face in a different window. It was faint, but it was there. I felt sweat building on my forehead. The more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't just one person. I saw two faces in total. One was the middle-aged woman and the other seemed like an older man, maybe in his 50s or 60s. They appeared in different windows, never together in the same shot, but always looking at my camera. In one picture the reflection was so clear that I could see the lines on the man's forehead. My hands were shaking a bit. I tried to breathe normally, telling myself it was probably a weird trick of the light, but I knew that was unlikely. My camera is top-notch. I know how reflections work. There was no one there when I was outside. I know I was alone. I spent hours going through each photo, zooming in on every window. There were around 10 shots with reflections. Each time it was either the woman or the man. Their expressions never changed. They just looked blank, like they were staring out at me. I felt a dull ache in the back of my head. I realized I had goosebumps on my arms. I shut my computer down and tried to get some sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day I decided to go back. I wanted to see if there was some explanation, like a trick of the glass. I drove out there in the morning. The sky was clear and bright. The field still had the same tall grass and the mansion looked the same. I walked around to the windows trying to figure out how a reflection could form. I looked at the angles, the way the sun was hitting the glass. Nothing seemed unusual. I took more pictures, checking them on my camera's screen every time. I didn't see anything odd in the previews, but that didn't mean much. The small screen can't show me the same detail as my monitor at home. I decided to go inside again, but I felt more cautious this time. I held my flashlight in one hand and my camera in the other. The house was silent. That weird tapping from before didn't happen. I looked in every room, opened some doors that weren't locked. I kept snapping photos. My chest felt tight, my breath was shallow. I kept expecting to see someone step out from a corner or appear behind a doorway, but there was no one there. The place was deserted. The couch in the living room was still there, the fireplace unchanged, dust coated everything. I climbed the stairs again, checking each room on the second floor. Most rooms were empty, just broken furniture and dusty floors. In one room I found an old metal bed frame and a stained mattress. The curtains were torn and they swayed slightly in a draft. I felt a cold chill on my neck and the hair on my arm stood up. I heard a faint squeaking sound like a loose hinge. I spun around, shining my flashlight. Nothing. My mouth felt dry. I forced myself to keep going. I took a few more photos and then left. My heart was pounding. By the time I stepped outside, I could taste a metallic tang in my mouth, probably from fear or adrenaline. Back at home, I loaded the new photos. I felt my throat tightened when I saw the same faces again. They appeared in multiple windows, sometimes on the first floor, sometimes on the second. The woman's eyes were the same. The man's face was the same. No difference in their expressions. It was like they were frozen in place, just moving from window to window. My fingers trembled as I clicked through the pictures. I felt a wave of nausea, but I kept looking. I wanted some logical explanation. I wanted to see a glitch or a flaw in the glass, but these reflections looked too real. For the next few days I couldn't focus on anything else. I showed the photos to a close friend who also does photography. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the screen and shook his head. He said he had no idea how I'd capture these images if there wasn't anyone inside. Then he asked if I'd actually seen any people when I was shooting. I told him no, of course not. He suggested I leave it alone. He said I might be mess with something I shouldn't. That made me uneasy, but I didn't believe in anything supernatural. I just believed in things that can be explained somehow. I decided to go back one more time to see if I could catch someone there. It was late afternoon again. The sun was low and the house cast a long shadow across the field. I parked my car and walked quietly through the grass. I stayed near the trees, trying to watch the windows from a distance. I had binoculars with me. I watched the second floor windows for a while. I saw nothing. Then I moved around to the side of the mansion, checking more windows. Still nothing. I was sweating. My pulse felt fast. I noticed my hands were shaky. I took a few pictures from the distance just in case. Eventually I forced myself to step onto the porch and peer inside through a cracked window. The living room was dark. I couldn't see anything unusual. Then I heard a thump from somewhere upstairs. It was a single heavy sound. I stood frozen. My heart pounded. I waited a few seconds, hoping to see something move inside it. Stayed dark and still. My stomach felt tight. I decided I wasn't going in. I'd already tested my luck enough. I left and went home to check the pictures. The reflection was there again. This time it was the woman in a window near the porch. She looked closer, I mean physically closer to the glass, like she was right against it. I could see the outline of her hair, the way it fell on her forehead. Her eyes were wide. My lungs felt like they couldn't expand fully. I closed all my files and sat there in silence. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. For a few days I tried to ignore the whole thing. I worked on other assignments. I took photos of an old warehouse across town and tried to forget about the mansion, but at night I kept picturing those faces staring out from those windows. I kept feeling the chill on my neck, like they were behind me. I didn't sleep well. I started triple checking my apartment door before bed. My appetite dipped. I felt anxious all the time. I'd never been this on edge from a photo shoot in my life. I decided to store the Mansion photos on an external drive. I moved them off my main computer hoping that I wouldn't stumble across them, but I still thought about them. I started to wonder if I should contact the local historical society to see if there was a record of the owners or any events tied to the place, but a part of me just wanted to drop it my friends. Words stuck with me. Maybe I'm messing with something I shouldn't. I'm not a superstitious person, but I also don't want to keep poking at this. I never ended up returning to the mansion after that. My curiosity lost out to my gut feeling. To this day, whenever I drive anywhere near that area, I feel the hair on my arm stand up. I won't even glance in that direction. The photos are still on my external drive. I haven't deleted them and I haven't shown them to anyone else. Every once in a while I catch myself hovering the mouse over that folder thinking about opening it. Then I feel my stomach churn and I decide it's not worth it. That's my story. It still feels unreal, but I know what I saw in those pictures. I know those faces weren't there when I was looking through the lens. I know I was alone, yet there they were, showing up in multiple shots, staring back at me with those blank expressions. They never moved or changed, they just watched. I can't explain it. I can only tell you that it scared me more than any crumbling staircase or squeaking door ever did. Now I stick to safer ruins, ones that don't have odd reflections or random thumps, and I don't plan on visiting that mansion again. It can stay there empty with its faces pressed against the glass waiting for someone else to come by. I'm done with it, and that's enough for me. I never asked for this mansion, and I sure didn't expect to inherit it out of nowhere. I've been a real estate broker for a while, mostly dealing with modern condos and smaller properties. Old estates never interested me, so when the lawyer told me my great-uncle had left me his huge worn-down home, I felt a mix of confusion and annoyance. Still, I drove out here, took one look at the sagging porch, the crooked shutters, and the overgrown yard, and decided I'd stay just long enough to fix it up and sell it. That was the plan. I had no idea how much my nights here would change everything I thought I knew about a quiet house. I got here on a Thursday afternoon. The place is set back from a dirt road hidden behind gnarled trees and thick bushes. The front gate is rusted and the driveway is cracked. I parked by the front steps and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment before heading in. I could tell the house hadn't been touched in decades. Dust coated the floors, the windows smelled stale. I felt a weird chill when I stepped inside. It wasn't cold outside, but I felt a breeze pass through the foyer. There was an open window somewhere. I checked around and didn't see anything. I tried not to overthink it. I set my bags down in what used to be the living room. The old furniture was covered in sheets. A grandfather clock stood next to the staircase, but it wasn't ticking. I lifted a corner of the sheet on the couch and saw water stains. I shrugged it off and decided to stay in a smaller bedroom near the back of the house to avoid the worst of the dust. I brought in a folding cot and some basic necessities. My plan was to tackle one room at a time, fix things up enough so the place could pass inspection, then I'd list it at some inflated price and wait for someone to swoon over its old world charm. My first night was rough. The wind was howling outside and the old walls creaked. I've been in creaky houses before, so it didn't really bother me. Around midnight I woke up hungry and went to the kitchen to check if the fridge still worked. It didn't, so I settled for a bottle of water and some crackers from my bag. The floor felt cold under my feet. The overhead light flickered once or twice but stayed on. I told myself the wiring was old by 2 a.m. I was tossing and turning on my cot, unable to sleep. That was the first time I heard the conversations in the walls. It started as a faint murmur, something like two voices. I couldn't hear what they were saying. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The Voices sounded calm, like people talking about everyday stuff, whether chores, maybe errands. I felt my pulse speed up, my mouth went dry. I checked every inch of that room. There was no radio, no TV, no phone, just my phone on the nightstand, and it was on silent mode. I put my hand on the wall and felt a light vibration. My heart pounded and I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the pipes or the wind. I tried to ignore it. Eventually around 4 in the morning I dozed off. The next morning I woke up later than I wanted. My phone's alarm didn't go off. I probably forgot to set it. I checked the time and realized I'd slept through half the morning. I showered in the cracked old bathroom. The hot water worked, but the water had a slight odor. After I got dressed, I decided to explore the house a bit. The walls looked normal in the daylight. I could see where the paint was peeling. Some panels were loose. I tapped one panel where I'd heard the voices, but I didn't hear anything. I made a mental note to check for old wiring or rodents. I spent most of that day clearing debris from the attic. I found boxes of my great-uncle's belongings, old letters, documents, pictures, nothing too interesting, just accounts of local events, some property records. I came across a stack of dusty pictures of this same house back when it was new. People in old-fashioned clothes stood on the porch smiling stiffly for the camera. I threw everything back in the boxes. I felt a dull headache by mid-afternoon, probably dust or mold. I decided to take a break and go to the small town store for some supplies. I bought cleaning items, some basic groceries, and a few flashlights. I chatted with the store clerk briefly. She asked if I was staying at the old mansion on the hill. I said yes. She shook her head and warned me about possible structural hazards. I told her I'd be careful on my way out. She patted my shoulder and told me to watch my step. Her tone was odd, but I didn't think too much about it. That second night I set up a radio on the kitchen counter for some background noise, but the signal was terrible. I tried a local station static. I tried to ignore the emptiness of the place. I heated some canned soup on the stove. The gas worked, but the flame flickered a lot. After dinner I walked around the house with a flashlight, checking loose floorboards. The sense of unease was still there, but I told myself it was just the isolation. It was after midnight when I got back to the small bedroom. My eyes felt heavy, but my mind wouldn't settle. I turned off the lamp and lay down on the cot. The house settled with groans and knocks. Then I heard the voices again, clearer this time. 2 distinct voices, one male, one female. They talked about me. I heard my name. My heart started to race. My hands felt clammy. I tried to control my breathing. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The male voice said something about tomorrow, and the female voice mentioned the attic ladder and broken rung. Then everything went quiet. I didn't sleep for hours. I just kept staring at the ceiling, replaying what I heard in my head. Eventually exhaustion took over. I woke up in the morning with stiff shoulders and a pounding headache. I drank 2 cups of strong coffee before heading to the attic. My plan was to ignore the voices. They had to be in my mind, or maybe some echo through the vents, but I remembered the phrase about a broken rung. I hadn't noticed a problem with the ladder. Still, I climbed up slowly. Halfway up I felt the ladder give way under my foot. 1 rung snapped right off. I caught myself on the step above, panting, heart pounding in my throat. I could have fallen backwards 6 feet onto a pile of old boxes. My arms shook. I climbed back down carefully, mind racing. The voices had predicted it. There was no other explanation. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but it left me uneasy. I spent the rest of the day checking the house for hazards. My hands were sweaty the whole time, and my mind kept replaying the words broken rung. I patched up some cracks in the walls, replaced some old hinges, and avoided the attic that evening. I kept the radio on low, but it didn't stop my thoughts. Around 10 I was fighting a headache, and my Stomach felt tight. I lay in bed staring at the dark. My body felt tense, my neck ached, and I couldn't get comfortable. Around midnight the murmuring started again. I stayed on the cot trying not to move. My pulse thudded in my ears. The female voice spoke first. She said something about the living room, about me moving furniture. The male voice laughed. It was a short, dry laugh. Then he said my name again. My scalp prickled and my breathing turned shallow. I forced myself to listen carefully. They talked about me tripping over something. They said I'd twist my ankle. I felt a trickle of sweat run down on my temple. My mind went to the living room, to the heavy furniture there, to the broken coffee table leg I'd seen earlier in the morning. I decided I wouldn't go near the living room. I focused on the kitchen walls, scraping off old paint and prepping it for a fresh coat. My hands shook a little each time I remembered the voices. After lunch I forgot about the warning and carried a bucket of tools through the living room to get outside to my truck. Halfway through the room I kicked one of the sheet-covered chairs. It slid across the floor and smashed into a small table behind it. The edge of the table caught the side of my ankle. I felt a sharp sting. I dropped the bucket and cursed. I hobbled out to the porch and sat on the steps, feeling my ankle throb. It wasn't broken, but it hurt bad. Sweat dotted my forehead. My breathing was ragged. The voices were right again. By that point I was scared. I couldn't ignore it anymore. These conversations in the walls were predicting my accidents. I thought about leaving, but the mansion was my responsibility, and I was halfway through a bunch of repairs. I decided to stay but be more vigilant. I told myself I'd avoid listening to those voices. I tried earplugs that night. Useless. I still heard them muffled but clear enough. They talked about small stuff at first: tools, nails, groceries. Then they mentioned me, said something about me. Finally noticing them, my legs twitched with nervous energy. I got out of bed and paced. Then I heard the female voice say, "He'll see the door tomorrow. He'll try to open it." The male voice responded, "He won't like what he finds." Then silence. I had no idea what door they meant. The house had a bunch of doors: bedrooms, closets, the cellar. I decided to search. The next morning my hands trembled as I opened every door in the house. I checked closets and storage rooms. Everything looked normal. By afternoon I was exhausted. My ankles still hurt and my nerves were on edge. The worst part was the quiet. The daytime had no voices. They only showed up at night. I almost wanted them to speak during the day so I could confront whatever was happening that night. The tension made my skin crawl. I tried to read an old newspaper I'd found, but I couldn't focus on the words. I sat on the edge of my court, tapping my foot. Around midnight the walls started to whisper again. This time the male voice said, "The basement door." The female voice replied, "He'll open it. He won't turn back." My mouth went dry. I'd only been in the basement once to check the fuse box. It was cramped and smelled musty. I remembered seeing a locked door down there. I hadn't tried to open it because I assumed it was a utility closet or some old storage room. The next day I limped down to the basement with a hammer, a flashlight, and a screwdriver. The overhead bulb was dim. The floor was uneven concrete. My skin prickled at the damp air. I moved a stack of paint cans to see the locked door. It was made of heavy wood with chipped paint and a rusty lock. My heart beat faster as I knelt to inspect the lock. It looked old, probably easy to break. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. My rational mind line told me it was just a basement door. The tension in my chest told me otherwise. I jammed a screwdriver into the lock and hit it with the hammer until the lock snapped. Then I pulled the door open. My flashlight revealed a narrow space filled with dusty shelves. There were no weird decorations or hidden passages, just a cramped storage area with boxes of old wires, rusted tools, and a few sacks of rock salt. I felt a weird mix of relief and confusion. I checked everything. Nothing Out of the ordinary, yet I still felt watched. I left the door open and went upstairs feeling uneasy. That night I expected the voices to talk about what I'd found. I stayed awake reading a home improvement guide. Around 1 o'clock in the morning I heard them again. The male voice sounded frustrated. He said he found nothing. He thinks that's all. The female voice whispered he doesn't know how deep it goes. I felt my entire body tense, my throat constricted, and I realized I was holding my breath. I heard the male voice say, "We show him or we wait." The female voice answered, "We wait. He's not ready." Then silence. I tried to sleep, but my stomach churned, my skin felt clammy. I thought about the day's tasks. Installing new light fixtures, patching holes. I wondered if there was another secret door or maybe a hidden panel. The idea of searching the entire house from top to bottom made me feel dizzy. I forced myself out of bed. At dawn I ran a cold shower and stayed under the water until my teeth chattered. Then I put on my clothes, drank black coffee, and started tapping on the walls in the downstairs hallway. I moved a painting off one wall and found a loose section of paneling. My pulse quickened. I pried it open. Behind it was a small cavity with old wiring, nothing else. I exhaled slowly. My hands were shaking, but I kept going, checking corners and floors. By late afternoon I was exhausted and sweaty. I felt my ankles ache. My arms were sore from prying panels. I decided I'd had enough. I collapsed onto the dusty couch in the living room, ignoring the musty smell. I stared at the ceiling fan, which wasn't running because the wiring upstairs was still bad. I thought about the voices. Maybe they thrived on my fear. Maybe if I stopped reacting they'd lose their hold. It was just a thought. I got up to make dinner. The kitchen was quiet, just the hum of the old stove. I ate a sandwich, then went back to my bedroom, leaving the hallway lights on. That night the voices sounded agitated. The male voice said he's resisting. We have to show him. The female voice whispered tomorrow will change his mind. My heart rate shocked up and my hands clenched into fists. I felt a tingling in my arms. I tried to breathe slowly. I shut my eyes and tried to push the sound away. The voices went silent. I didn't sleep much. In the morning I walked the entire house waiting for something horrible to happen. I expected a loose floorboard to collapse or maybe a short circuit to spark a fire. Nothing happened. The day went smoothly. I replaced rotted window frames. I hammered new nails into the porch steps. I even ate lunch on the porch, feeling the warm air on my face. I almost believed that the voices were done, but as dusk fell I felt a chill run down my back. The windows rattled slightly. I decided to wait out the night in the living room with a flashlight and my phone ready. The sky turned dark. The old house settled, making those strange sounds again. Around midnight I heard them in the walls. They were angry. The male voice hissed, "He's ignoring us." The female voice said, "We force his hand, we show him." Then my phone buzzed. No calls, just the battery alert. I plugged it in, but the charger wouldn't work. The overhead light flickered. I felt the floor vibrate beneath me. I jumped up, heart racing. I ran to the main hallway. The entire house felt like it was humming. Then it stopped. I waited, breathing hard. My limbs felt shaky. I looked around in silence, flashlight beam darting across the dusty floors. Nothing else happened. No big collapse, no sudden appearance, just the sound of my own rapid breathing echoing off the walls. I stayed there, leaning against the banister, struggling to calm down. Eventually I returned to my cot, feeling every muscle in my body ache. My head throbbed. I kept the flashlight on, shining it at the spot on the wall where I usually heard them. I muttered, "What do you want?" No answer. I felt drained, but I refused to lie down. My eyelids felt heavy. Then I heard the woman's voice right next to my ear, quiet but clear. "He's ready." I spun around, stumbling over the edge of the cot. There was nothing. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I fumbled for my phone to call someone, anyone. No signal. My throat felt tight. I wanted to get out, but I couldn't leave. I felt anchored, like the house wouldn't let me go. So now I'm here sitting on the edge of the cot. The sun is about to rise and I haven't slept. I don't know if the voices will ever stop. They predict things, they manipulate events in my day. I can't explain it, I can't ignore it. I only know that each time they speak something happens. I keep trying to fix the house, but the more I fix, the more I realize there's something behind these walls that I can't fix with a hammer or nails. My ankle still hurts from that table and my shoulders ache from all the tension. My nerves feel raw. I plan to make a call later today. I might hire a team to finish these renovations for me, or maybe I'll look for an exorcist, even though I don't believe in that kind of thing. I just want this house off my hands. I want a normal life again. I don't want to hear those whispers in the night predicting every stumble, every mistake, every piece of my day. But for now I'm stuck in this place, listening to the walls, waiting for the next thing they'll say, and I don't know if I'll ever feel safe here again. I was in the basement of the old records building late on a Tuesday night. The air down there always felt thick, like it had moved in decades. I'd been sent to catalog a series of file boxes that no one had touched in years. My boss told me to toss anything I considered worthless, but I hesitated to throw out records without taking a closer look. That's how I found the shoe box of cassette tapes. At first I thought they were personal recordings of some former employee. Then I noticed a label on one tape with a date that hadn't happened yet. It read March 14th, 2026, but the year was 2025. I held that tape in my hand for a long moment. My stomach tightened. I felt a rush of heat across my neck. I wanted to dismiss it as an error. I told myself that maybe someone had mislabeled it or made a joke, but I took the tape to the small office at the far end of the basement. I found an old cassette player there, covered in dust and grime. My hand shook a little when I opened the tape deck. The door squeaked and I slid the cassette inside. I pressed play and I heard static. Then I heard a voice. It was my voice. I heard it say, "I'm standing in the corner of my living room trying to decide if I should answer the phone." The recording continued, describing a mundane event. It mentioned the exact brand of coffee I'd started drinking last week. It mentioned how I felt anxious about an upcoming presentation at work. The tape ended with a mention of a small power outage in my apartment complex. The voice said it would happen around 9 p.m. The next day my mouth felt dry, my chest felt tight. I wondered if I was losing my mind. I looked around the small room, half expecting someone to jump out and tell me it was a prank. Nobody was there. It was just me, the cassette player, and those tapes. I ejected the tape, turned it over in my hands, and checked it again. The label still said March 14th. 2026, but that date was over a year away. I tried to brush it off and told myself the voice just sounded similar to mine. When I got home that night, I replayed what I had heard in my head. I fixed a quick dinner and sat in front of the TV, trying to ignore the anxiety that crept through my body. My mind kept going back to that tape. I ended up checking the time every few minutes as it got closer to 9 p.m. When the clock hit 9:03 p.m. and the lights were still on, I felt relieved. I even laughed a little, thinking I'd spooked myself for no reason. But at 9:07 p.m. the power cut out. It stayed out for about 10 seconds, then it snapped back on. I sat in my living room staring at the lights. My heart pounded and sweat formed on my forehead. The cassette had predicted this. It wasn't a huge blackout, just a flicker, but it matched the tape. I stood there with my hands shaking. I paced around my apartment for half an hour, Trying to come up with a rational explanation, I told myself maybe it was a coincidence, but I couldn't ignore the timing. The next morning I went back to the basement. I tried to focus on my regular tasks, but my eyes kept drifting toward that shoe box. I decided to check the other cassettes. Most of them had dates that were months or years from now. Some had no dates at all, just short phrases on the labels. One said the meeting, another said the car, another read the leak. They were all in my handwriting, though I had no memory of making these labels. I felt a tremor in my chest that moved up to my throat. My lips went dry and I pressed them together. I took a second tape labeled the meeting and put it in the player. I heard my voice again. It mentioned something about a meeting with the head of the archives department. It talked about the way I'd be assigned a new project. Then I heard specific details: my boss's outfit, the time of day, the frustration I'd feel. The tape ended with my own voice saying I walk out of that room knowing I can't escape this situation. The hairs on my arms stood up when I heard myself say that. I checked the small basement clock on the wall. It was almost noon. My boss had told me earlier that she wanted to see me at 1 p.m. to talk about next quarter's plans. I felt my throat tighten and I started to sweat again. I told myself to ignore the tape and see what would happen. Actually happened at 12:50 p.m. I headed upstairs to her office. My chest felt hollow and my ears were ringing. The meeting started exactly at 1 p.m. She wore a gray blazer just like the tape described. She told me the archivist department was restructuring. I'd be taking on a more demanding role. She used the phrase new project. My palms were wet against the arms of the chair. Every detail lined up with the tape. The meeting ended and I walked out feeling cornered and exhausted, just like the tape said. I returned to the basement. After that, the lights in the corridor flickered and I found myself glancing around, wondering if I was being watched. My back tensed as I pushed open the heavy metal door. The shoe box was still on the desk where I'd left it. I wanted to toss those tapes in the trash, but I needed to know more. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, but I played another tape. This one had no label except the word work scrolled in black marker. I heard my voice describing events that would happen over the next few days. It mentioned a small argument with a coworker about mislabeled files. It mentioned that I'd burn my hand on the coffee machine. It mentioned that I'd find a hidden corridor in the basement that led to a storage area I never knew existed. My breath caught in my throat at that last part. One didn't think there was any hidden corridor down here, but the tape said I'd trip on a loose tile and push against the wall at the end of the room. It would swing open to reveal an older section of the basement. I shook my head, not wanting to believe it. The next day I was reorganizing old folders when a coworker came down. He said one of my boxes was mislabeled and he was annoyed because it set back his inventory. We argued for a few minutes, then he left. It was a small confrontation, but it matched the tape. I tried to stay calm, but I felt myself shaking. Later that same day I stopped by the break room to make coffee. The machine splashed hot water on my left hand and I jerked back, muttering curses under my breath. My hand stung and I ran it under cold water, thinking about the tape's words. I was so tense I had trouble focusing on the simplest tasks. That afternoon I was carrying a stack of binders across the basement. I tripped on a loose tile, almost dropping the binders. I reached out to steady myself and my palm pressed against a section of the far wall. I heard a faint click and the wall moved about too, and my heart jumped into my throat. I pushed again and the wall pivoted on hidden hinges. A musty smell rushed out from the darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from a nearby shelf and shined it into the space. I saw rows of crates and stacked boxes in a chamber that looked older than the rest of the basement. My breath was shaky as I stepped inside. My flashlight beam flickered over decaying cardboard board, rusted metal shelves, and piles of old records. I also saw a small desk in the corner with a broken chair next to it. That desk had a cassette player on top of it. It was a different model than the one I'd been using, but it was dusty and obviously old. I walked over and nudged the chair aside with my foot. I felt a tightness in my chest as I picked up the cassette player. The power cord was frayed next to it. I saw a pile of unlabeled tapes. They were the same brand as the ones I'd found in the shoe box. I felt a jolt of adrenaline course through me. My head felt light and my breathing got shallow. I didn't know what I'd uncover if I stayed there. My legs felt weak and I ended up leaving the secret room. I pulled the hidden door shut behind me, my hands trembling against the cold metal. I sat at my usual desk trying to calm down. The events described on the tapes had all happened. I couldn't deny it anymore. My voice on those recordings was real. It predicted my future. I felt my heart pounding as I considered what that meant for my life. I rummaged through the shoe box and counted the tapes. There were 20 in total. Most were labeled with dates or cryptic words. Some of the dates were only a few weeks away, others were months away, and a few were more than a year into the future. One tape had today's date on it. I pulled it out and saw the label today. My head throbbed as I slid it into the cassette player. I braced myself for whatever I'd hear. My voice came through the static. It said, "I'm standing in the basement at around 5 in the afternoon, too scared to open the next door. I keep checking the corridor to make sure I'm alone. I feel my heart pounding. I listen to the recording of myself describing these exact actions. I realize I can't avoid the next step. I paused the tape. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4:55 p.m. My chest felt like it was vibrating. I pressed play again, clenching my teeth. The voice said, "I know I can't throw these tapes away. I'll try to figure out who made them or why they exist, but I'm afraid of what I'll discover next." That was the end. I stood there in silence. My mouth went dry and I felt the blood pounding in my temples. I wrapped the tapes in an old newspaper, grabbed the cassette player, and stuffed everything into my duffel bag. I checked the corridor outside. It was empty. I hurried up the stairs and left the building. On the drive home, I kept glancing at the bag on the passenger seat. I felt the tension in my shoulders. My jaw was clenched so tight that it ADHD. I kept telling myself to focus on the road, but my mind replayed every word of my own recorded voice. When I got home, I locked my door and double-checked my windows. I sat at the kitchen table with the cassette player in front of me. I wanted to listen to every tape, but I also wanted to leave them in a trash bin somewhere far away. I couldn't shake the feeling that once I heard them, I'd be trapped by whatever future they described. My hands were shaking and sweat dripped down my temples. I reached out, grabbed another tape labeled "Next Week" and slid it into the machine. The sound crackled. My voice started describing a situation at the grocery store. It said I'd run into an old friend from college. It said we'd end up discussing a problem with the archive building's foundation. I listened to every detail, my pulse racing. It mentioned a small crack in the floor near my desk. The tape ended with the words, "I realize these tapes are controlling me, but I can't stop listening." I snapped the player off. My breathing was shallow. I tried to fight the urge to keep going, but I felt drawn to the tapes. It was like I needed to know more about what was coming over the next few days. I tested the predictions. The grocery store event happened exactly as the tape said. The friend I hadn't seen in years recognized me. He asked about my job. He mentioned structural problems in old buildings. I stood there in the cereal aisle, my heart Hammering, my hands felt sweaty on the cart handle. This kept happening with each tape. Every single detail came true. I started losing sleep. I'd wake up at night, my heart pounding, expecting to hear my own voice in the darkness. At work, I jumped at small noises in the basement, half convinced someone was watching me. I thought about telling someone else, but I couldn't imagine how they'd react. The tapes kept piling up in my apartment. I played each one in secret. My voice described conversations with co-workers, random events in the city, and small personal habits I hadn't formed yet but soon found myself doing. Now I'm sitting here describing everything that's happened so far. I know there are tapes that go far beyond next month. I can't bring myself to play them all at once. I feel my legs shaking under the table. My hands feel cold. I keep looking at the cassette labeled 1 year from now. I'm too scared to press play, but I also can't throw it away. Part of me wants to understand how these tapes exist. Part of me worries that if I don't listen, I'll miss something important. My heart won't stop thumping in my chest as I stare at the pile of cassettes. I plan to go back to that secret room in the basement tomorrow. I want to see if there's any clue about who recorded these tapes. Maybe I'll find a piece of paper, a photograph, or some evidence that explains how my voice is on them. My stomach churns at the thought of going back down there, but I can't avoid it. The tapes describe my own future, and they keep getting it right. It's like they have a grip on my left life that I can't break. I keep replaying that first tape in my mind, hearing my own voice talk about an event that hadn't happened yet, felt impossible, but then the event happened exactly as described. Just a few hours later, every time I think I might be able to walk away from all this, something else lines up with the tapes. It's not a dream, it's not a prank. I hear my own voice, and it's always correct about what's going to happen. I can't brush it off. I'm trapped in this pattern. My heart is pounding as I finish telling the story. I'm looking at the cassette player on my right. I'm looking at the stack of tapes on my left. I feel sweat collecting on my forehead. I just check my apartment's windows again. They're locked. The next tape I plan to listen to is labeled tomorrow night. Maybe it will tell me I'll make a breakthrough. Maybe it will describe something I don't want to face. I don't see a way out. All I can do is press play, listen to my own voice, and wait for the events to unfold. My life hasn't been the same since I found those tapes, and I know it never will be again. I felt a knot in my stomach the moment I stood on the concrete edge of the dam. I had done this job hundreds of times before I'd arrive early, check my gear, talk to the supervisor, and get in the water. It was always straightforward, but that morning the water looked darker. It was the same shade of murky green it always had, but something about it made me uneasy. I glanced at my oxygen tanks, tested my regulator, and wiped sweat off my forehead. I told myself I was just tired from a poor night's sleep. That explanation didn't make the feeling go away, though. I forced a deep breath, tugged on my mask straps, and gave the signal to the crew member watching me. Then I slid into the water. I remember the cold hitting my face first. It made my skin tighten. My heartbeat thumped hard in my ears, but that happens every time I slip under. I'd always liked that initial shock because it kept me alert. Usually I'd settle into a steady breathing rhythm. Once I got deeper, my flashlight cut through the gloom in front of me. As I descended along the dam's concrete wall, there was algae in thin patches near the surface, but most of the wall was smooth. Where I was working, I reached the 30T mark. My plan was to inspect a crack that had been reported during a previous survey. I checked my watch, checked my depth gauge, then kicked toward the spot. My breathing steadied, and the hiss of air moving in and out of the regulator replaced my earlier anxiety. That's when I heard it for the first time. A faint melody drifted through the water. It sounded like An old recording, the volume was low, but I could hear brass instruments. It reminded me of some vintage radio tune people might have heard in the 1930s or 1940s. I shook my head and checked my comm line, thinking maybe someone topside was playing music near the microphone. The line was clear, nobody was saying anything. I tapped my ear, thinking maybe I had water in there causing some distortion. The tune still floated in the background. I tried to ignore it. I had a job to do, and I figured maybe my mind was playing a trick on me. I approached the cracked section of concrete, positioned my flashlight, and began my inspection. The crack wasn't too big, maybe a few inches wide, running vertically. I rubbed a finger along its edge. It felt rough, probably needed a patch job. I reached down to grab my camera from the tool belt. As I raised it toward the crack, I noticed the music was getting louder. It wasn't blaring, but it seemed closer. I heard the trump and a steady drum pattern. The water around me vibrated with that old-timey quality, like a record with slight static. My lungs tightened, my pulse kicked up a notch. I wanted to believe it was just in my head, but the sound felt too real. I looked around with my flashlight. There was nothing there except the mottled gray of the concrete and the swirling particles of debris in the water. I took a few pictures of the crack, focusing on the job. Then I pushed off the wall to investigate another area. As I swam, the music kept playing in my ears, but it shifted in and out like a weak radio station with poor reception. I tried tapping my helmet again. Nothing changed. I moved to the next section of the wall, ignoring the tension in my gut. I pointed my camera at some bolts that sometimes rust. I snapped a few shots. That's when I felt something tap against my mask. It was a gentle knock, like someone rapping on a window. I jerked my head back and blinked. I looked at the inside of my mask and saw a damp handprint. It was right in front of my eyes on the inside. I froze, my heart hammered, and my breathing got ragged. I lifted my hand to wipe it away, but before I touched the glass, the print vanished. I could still see a faint smudge like condensation, but it was fading. My chest felt tight and I tasted bitter adrenaline in my mouth. I looked around me with wide eyes. My flashlight beam shook from how tense my arm had become. There was nothing out there, no diver, no fish, no drifting piece of trash that could explain that I wanted to surface right away, but I was also worried the guys up top would think I was losing it. I'd always been the steady one. I'd been diving for a decade, never had a panic attack, never had any weird incidents. I figured I might have rubbed my face or something without noticing. Still, it didn't feel right. I SW around the next corner of the wall, checking for more cracks. My watch told me I'd been underwater for 10 minutes. The music was still there, sometimes loud, sometimes fading. It was some kind of swing tune with horns and a steady snare drum. It drifted from every direction. My arms and legs felt heavier than usual. My breath was uneven. The regulator hissed with each inhale and exhale. After a few more minutes of moving along the wall, I decided to signal the surface I needed the break. I didn't want to say on the comm line I'm hearing music and seeing handprints in my mask, but I told the surface crew I needed to check something topside. They acknowledged and I slowly ascended, making sure not to move too fast. My safety stops felt like they dragged on, but I wasn't going to skip them. I stared into the dark water around me. The music dimmed as I went higher, but I could still pick up the faint sound in the distance. When I broke the surface, the sunlight felt harsh. My co-worker Tony looked at me with concern. He asked if I was okay. I nodded and removed my mask. I told him I had some condensation issues and wanted to see if my comm line was picking up stray signals. He shook his head and said they hadn't heard anything unusual. He asked if I wanted to switch out or take a break. I said I was fine, just needed a minute. I walked a few steps away, took off my gear and inspected my mask. I looked for cracks or any Sign of damage. Everything looked normal, no weird prints on the inside. The faceplate was clean, my gloves were fine. I rubbed my eyes and drank some water. My face felt hot even though I was out of the cold water. I thought about telling Tony what was happening, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead I said I'd give it another try. He shrugged and told me to be careful. I put my mask back on, checked my seat heels, and went back under. This time I tried to focus on the dam structure. I turned on my flashlight and made my way to the base near the outflow. I was supposed to check the grates and see if there was any debris. My depth gauge read around 40 feet. Once I reached the lower portion, the water was colder down there, and my breathing echoed in my head. The old music came back, still playing in a distant way. It felt more intense now, like it was surrounding me. My arms trembled and I gripped the outflow grate. The metal was slick, covered in a thin film of algae. I tried to pull myself together. Then, as I turned my head to check the bolts, I noticed a shape moving off to the side. I swung my flashlight toward it. I saw nothing, no fish, no drifting cloth, just empty water, but that fleeting motion made my muscles tighten even more. My heart pounded in my chest and I squeezed my regulator mouthpiece with my teeth. I tried to finish my inspection as quickly as possible. I was snapping photos of the grate, shining the beam of my flashlight along the edges. Then something brushed against my shoulder. It felt like a light touch, almost a hand resting there. I whipped around with my flashlight again. Nothing. The music got louder. I clenched my jaw so hard it HD. I moved away from the grate, heading back toward the wall. I felt a slight vibration in the water. My drums throbbed. The music seemed to shift into a slower tune, still old-fashioned, with a singer's voice drifting in and out. The words were muffled, impossible to make out, but the tone was calm and drawn out. I thought about turning around and making an immediate ascent, but my job required a full circuit around that section of the dam. Before finishing, I told myself to stick to the plan, get the photos, and get out. I pushed forward, scanning the wall. My flashlight illuminated a few cracks. My camera recorded them. My breathing was still off. My hand shook. Then, right as I was about to move to the final portion of the wall, I saw a fresh handprint on the inside of my mask. It was clearer this time. I could see the outline of fingers, the palm, and even the tiny lines that creased where a thumb might bend. It looked too detailed to be my glove or some random smudge. My stomach churned. I wanted to shout, but I only managed a strangled gasp into my regulator. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second and shook my head when I opened them. The handprint was still there. My mouth felt dry despite the regulator. My heartbeat felt like it was thumping in my throat. Then the print began to fade, like moisture evaporating. I raised my hand to wipe it off. I felt the smooth glass. My fingertips brushed the surface and the print vanished completely. The music kept playing and I could hear faint static like an old radio losing its station. I turned to head back up. I signaled the surface that I was coming in early. I didn't care if they questioned me about it. The supervisor's voice crackled in my ear, asking if everything was okay. I said I was just feeling a little off and needed to come up. They told me to take my time and ascend safely. I climbed the water column, care to do my stops. The music stayed with me up until about 20 feet, then it slowly faded. By the time I breached the surface, I couldn't hear it anymore. Tony and another guy reached down to help me onto the platform. They asked if something had gone wrong with my gear. I shook my head. My face must have looked pale because Tony got concerned and asked if I needed to sit down. I nodded and sat on the edge, removing my mask and regulator. My chest felt tight. I was breathing hard. I avoided eye contact with them because I didn't know how to explain what had just happened. Tony asked if I'd heard or seen anything weird. I paused. I finally admitted I'd been hearing something that sounded like old music and that I saw strange prints on my mask. Tony stared at me, then asked if I was messing with him. I told him no. He frowned and said we'd do a full check of my equipment. He thought maybe I had some condensation or a weird reflection. As for the music, he guessed it could have been interference on the comm or maybe a boat passing nearby playing old songs. I knew it wasn't that, but I just nodded. I didn't argue. We checked my mask regulator and comm line. Everything looked normal, no cracks, no leaks, no sign of malfunction. I sat there for a while trying to steady my pulse. My skin felt clammy and I noticed goosebumps on my arms. The tension in my neck and shoulders. ERS wouldn't go away. Tony said if I wanted to call it a day, he could finish the job or we could bring in someone else. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but I didn't want rumors going around that I was scared of the water. I've always taken pride in my reliability. After a short break, I decided to try one more quick dive just to check a couple of last details, so I could say I completed my assignment. Tony told me to be careful and I went under again, forcing my breath to slow. I descended only about 15 feet this time, not going as deep. I stayed near the top portion of the dam, scanning for anything obvious. The water was still dark, but there was a bit more light from above. I took a few photos of the top regions, joints and seals. I listened carefully for the music. I only heard the hiss of my regulator and the faint rush of water. No horns, no singing. It felt like maybe everything was back to normal. I was about to finish up when I saw a flash of movement to my right. I turned and in the distance I thought I saw a faint shape drifting. It disappeared as soon as I moved my flashlight beam toward it. I felt my scalp prickle. My heart rate soared again. I glanced at the inside of my mask. I didn't see any new prints, but I couldn't shake the dread in my gut. I signaled I was returning to the surface and moved up slowly. When I reached the top, I told Tony I was done. He didn't protest. My breathing was shaky and my arms felt weak. I climbed out and removed my gear. Another coworker walked over to ask how it went. I just shrugged. I didn't want to say much. I pulled off my wetsuit top and dried my face with a towel. My head pounded. The tension in my muscles made me feel stiff and restless. At the same time, I packed my equipment, got into my truck and drove away from the site. The entire ride home, I kept glancing at my mask in the passenger seat. I almost expected to see a handprint appear on the glass or hear that old music on the radio. Nothing happened, but my nerves were shot. When I got home, I took a shower, but I still felt cold. I kept thinking about that melody and how it made my skin crawl. I remembered the handprint, the shape I glimpsed in the water, and the brush on my shoulder that felt human. The next day, I reported my findings to my supervisor. He listened to my story and looked puzzled. He said there was no explanation for the music or the handprints. We both knew random sounds can transmit underwater, especially around old structures with echoing tunnels. He suggested I take a few days off, see if I felt better. I agreed, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion. I felt uneasy the entire time I was away from the dam. It was like I'd left something unresolved. I kept waiting for my phone to ring with questions about the job. It never did. People said everything looked fine in the photos and the repair team could handle the cracks. Nobody else reported hearing music. Nobody else found handprints. I still do my job. I still dive for dam maintenance and other underwater projects, but I haven't gone back to that exact dam since I told my boss I don't want that assignment anymore. He gave me a strange look but didn't push it. Occasionally I'll sit alone at home and swear I hear a few notes of those old horns in the distance just for a second before it disappears. It's always faint like a radio that isn't tuned in properly. I can't explain what I experienced in the water that day. I only know what I felt and what I saw. I'm not a superstitious person. I check my gear, follow safety protocols and pay attention to the environment, but none of that helped me when the music started. None of it explained the handprints or that touch on my shoulder. I know what I heard and what I felt. It still unsettles me. I think about it every time I prepare for a dive, and I can't forget the echo of that antique melody drifting through the cold dark water. I started my shift at the hotel with a quick look at my watch. 11 p.m. on the dot. The lobby was quiet. That was normal for a Tuesday night. I stood by the front doors, nodded at a guest who passed me on his way out, and took a moment to stretch my arms. My name's Joe and I've been the night doorman here for almost 4 years. Usually my biggest problems are drunk guests, missing room keys, and the occasional argument in the lobby. Everything else follows a routine, but a few nights ago something changed. I began to notice the elevator acting strange around the early hours. At first I thought I was imagining things, then it happened enough times for me to be sure the elevator was stopping on a floor that didn't exist. I'll start from the first night I noticed it. It was around 2 a.m. I was in my usual spot near the front desk, just standing there watching the empty lobby. I happened to glance at the elevator's digital panel above the doors. The numbers blinked in sequence as the elevator went from floor to floor, dropping someone off or maybe carrying them up. Then it happened. The panel showed 13 for a split second before going dark. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. The hotel has 12 floors. There's no 13th floor listed. The owners are superstitious, so they skipped that number. I'm not a big believer in stuff like that, but I know a lot of older buildings do the same thing, so that was a red flag right away. I walked over to the elevator and pressed the button. When the doors slid open, it was empty. The interior light was normal. I stood there for a moment, kind of puzzled. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the 12th floor, and rode it up. The ride was smooth. I got off on 12, walked around the hallway, and everything looked fine. I didn't see anyone. The hallway lights were on, the carpet was clean, and the vending machine in the corner hummed like usual. Nothing was out of place. I went back to the elevator, wrote it down, and told myself maybe I'd misread the panel. On the second night I kept my eye on the elevator's panel. Every time it moved I leaned against the front desk, arms crossed, watching those glowing numbers go up and down. People came and went around midnight. The bar crowd from the lounge on the ground floor headed out. A few folks returned to their rooms a bit tipsy. Then around 1:30 a.m. the elevator numbers on the panel cycled up to 12, paused, then flickered. It showed 13 for maybe half a second, then went blank. My heartbeat sped up. I felt this jump in my stomach like I'd caught a quick drop on a roller coaster. I walked straight to the elevator. Again the doors opened by themselves, as if someone inside had pressed the lobby button. But nobody was there. The next night I wanted to see more. I decided to test it around 2 a.m. when the lobby was dead. I stepped into the elevator and pressed each floor button one by one just to see if there was any glitch. Nothing happened. It stopped at each floor from 2 through 12 and then came back down. I checked the panel on every trip, no errors. By 3 a.m. I was certain it was just some glitch that happened at random times. I planned to forget about it, but then as I was stepping out of the elevator into the lobby, the doors closed behind me and I saw that panel display 13 again through the narrow gap it showed. Up for a second, then disappeared. The elevator went up without me. I felt my muscles tense. My hand started to sweat. I jabbed the call button. The elevator came back empty as usual. I got in. My heart was pounding, but I needed to see for myself what was happening. I pressed the button for 12. Then I waited. The elevator rose, passing floors 2, 3 for all the way up. At 1200 it stopped. The door stayed closed. The panel above the door inside the cabin flickered. It jumped from 12 to 13. Then the doors slid open. I stared at the hallway. It was dim. The walls seemed off, like they'd shifted a bit, creating a subtle tilt. The carpet looked frayed. The smell in the air reminded me of stale cigarette smoke and old wet fabric. My heart was thumping so hard that I felt a headache coming on. I stepped out just 1 foot into the hallway. The air felt thick. The lights overhead buzzed and one of them sputtered. There were doors along the corridor just like on any other floor, but they looked dusty. The door handle seemed tarnished. I swallowed and my throat felt dry. My hands trembled a little, so I clenched my fists to steady them. I felt like turning around, but my curiosity pulled me forward. I reached for the nearest door handle, but it didn't move. It was locked. I started to move along the hallway, 1 careful step at a time, checking each door. They were all locked. The place was quiet except for that faint buzzing. I could also hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. I walked about halfway down the hallway and noticed a flicker of movement near the far end. It might have been a shadow or a reflection. My stomach tightened. I rubbed my eyes to clear them, but when I looked again there was nothing there. I glanced back at the elevator. The door was still open, as if waiting. Something in my gut told me to go back. I turned around, hurried to the elevator and stepped inside. I pressed the lobby button. It closed with a smooth swish and the digital panel above the door blinked once. Then it went from 13 to 12 down to 1. Then the lobby, the door opened to the normal quiet ground floor. The lights were bright. The air felt different, almost refreshing. I walked out. My pulse was racing. I didn't say anything to anyone because nobody else was there except the front desk clerk, who was dozing behind the counter. The next night I tried to ignore what I'd seen. I told myself I must have been tired, but by 1 a.m. I could feel this tension in my chest, waiting for the elevator to display that forbidden floor again. I drank coffee to stay alert. My eyes kept flicking to the panel whenever someone used the elevator. Around 2:15 I saw it again. The numbers rose to 12. 12 stayed there, then flickered to 13 for a beat and vanished. I clenched my teeth. I walked over and pressed the button. Empty as always. I stepped inside. My head felt light, but I pressed 12. The same sequence happened. The elevator reached 12, paused, and then it opened onto that corridor. This time I forced myself to walk a bit farther. The doors behind me stayed open for a few seconds, then they slid shut without me pressing anything. That rattled me, but I kept going. My stomach churned. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my face. Each door looked the same as before. Old tarnished door knobs, chipped paint. The overhead lights buzzed. I heard a hum in the walls. It might have been the ventilation, but it sounded SLE. light bulb in the ceiling. The walls were lined with old wallpaper peeling around the edges. The smell in there was stale, like dirty laundry left in a closed bag. There was a table in the middle of the room with a few chairs. The table's surface was dusty. 1 chair was pulled out. I walked around it. The floor creaked. I saw footprints in the dust. They didn't match my shoes. I bent down to get a closer look, but they were faded. They led to a corner and just stopped. I felt a surge of nerves from my chest to my throat. I backed out of the room, closed the door, and hurried down the corridor, trying to find the elevator. The hallway seemed longer than before. The lights flickered, and I felt a rise in my pulse. Finally, I spotted the elevator doors at the far end. They were closed. My steps grew faster I jammed my finger on the call button. My ears rang with the silence around me. The doors opened. I darted inside and pressed the lobby button. My hands were shaking so much that I almost pressed something else by accident. The panel blinked from 13 to 12, then kept going down until the doors opened onto the lobby. I stumbled out. The normal lights and clean carpet welcomed me, and I felt my legs relax. I wiped my forehead with my sleeve. I checked around me to see if anyone had noticed. The front desk clerk was engrossed in the computer. A guest sat in one of the lobby chairs scrolling through something on a phone. No one looked at me. I stepped into the staff restroom, locked the door, and splashed water on my face. My reflection in the mirror was pale. My eyes were wide. My shirt was damp under my arms. I leaned against the sink, breathing hard. Eventually I calmed down enough to return to the lobby. That same night around 3:30 a.m. I saw the elevator's panel flash again. This time I stood still. I didn't chase it. I waited. The elevator came down to the lobby, paused, then the doors slid open by themselves. I stared at the empty cabin. My heart thumped in my chest. I wasn't about to do another trip without a plan. I left it alone. It stayed open for several seconds, then it closed, and the numbers on the panel returned to normal. Over the next few nights the same thing kept happening. Around 2 or 3 in the morning the panel would flicker. At 12 o'clock switch to 15 and open onto that distorted hallway. I ventured in 2 more times, but always briefly. I noticed more details each time. The smell was worse in some spots. The ceiling in one section dripped a bit of water onto the floor, and the paint on the walls looked bubbled. I never saw another person. I heard sounds, sometimes a scrape across the floor or a faint bang in the distance. My pulse would jump each time. My limbs felt hot, like adrenaline was coursing through me. I couldn't shake this dread. Whenever I stepped in there one night, I told the front desk clerk Jared that I suspected the elevator had a short or some mechanical glitch. I said I heard weird noises. He shrugged and said we'd have to report it to maintenance, but we both knew that building management took a long time to fix issues that didn't cause immediate problems for guests when the elevator was used by regular people. It worked fine and never showed 13. It only happened when the building was quiet. Jared didn't seem interested in doing anything about it. He had his own tasks, plus he rarely left the desk at night. I started to dread going anywhere near the elevator after 1 a.m. I kept busy by doing small cleaning chores around the lobby and near the entrance. I wiped down the windows, stacked flyers on the desk, and organized the lost and found drawer. But in the back of my mind I was always aware of that elevator. At some point in the night it was going to flash 13. I could feel a tightness in my shoulders whenever I thought about it. My legs felt tense, my lower back HDHD from standing in one place for too long. Last night was the worst so far. It was around 2:45 a.m. The panel showed 12, flickered, then hit 13. I decided I needed some sort of proof. I took my phone out, readied the camera, and stepped into the elevator. I pressed 12. When the doors opened to that hallway, I started recording. My phone's light illuminated the walls. I walked slowly, feeling the tightness in my chest. I passed a few doors, each locked. I walked until I reached that side corridor again. The door with no numbers was there, same as before. I saw those footprints leading into the corner of the small room, still faded, still ending without explanation. A dull scrape echoed behind me. My ears popped with the rush of my heartbeat. I spun around, phone in hand, but I only caught the edge of the corridor there was nothing in sight. I whispered a few curses under my breath. I turned the camera toward the door, the hallway, and everything around me. My mouth felt dry, my scalp tingled. That sense of being watched nagged at me even though I saw no one there. I backed away, phone shaking in my hand. When I returned to the elevator, the doors were shut. I pressed the call button and saw the light blink. It felt like the wait took forever. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to come around the corner. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The doors finally slid open and I jumped inside. I slapped the lobby button. The digital panel flicked from 13 to 12, then quickly descended. When it opened onto the lobby, I almost fell out. I rushed to the front desk and checked my phone screen. The video was full of static. The audio track captured some strange popping and crackling, but nothing else. I couldn't see the hallway. It was just darkness and flickers of distorted pixels. My hand trembled as I locked my phone and stuffed it into my pocket. I felt a wave of nausea in my stomach. I stood behind the desk for the rest of the shift, not talking to anyone, just staring at the elevator. From time to time it didn't stop at 13 again. That night when my shift ended at 7 a.m. I left the building as quickly as I could. I haven't told anyone else about what I saw because I don't think they'd believe me. They'd say I'm stressed or that I'm pranking them, but I know it's real. I've felt the thick air in that hallway. I've smelled the stale odor on my clothes afterward. I've heard those knocks and scrapes. I've seen the warped walls, flickering lights and locked doors. I don't plan to step foot there again unless I have to, but in my job I might not have a choice. If I see the elevator go to 13, I'm going to stand there in the lobby and pretend I don't notice. That's my plan for now. I'm just trying to keep myself calm and get through my shift. That's all I can do. If the elevator calls, I'm going to ignore it. I don't want to see that place anymore. I don't know what's in there and I'm not sure I want to find out. The first time I noticed the problem, I felt a jolt in my stomach that made me stop what I was doing and stare at the clock on my workbench. It was 3:33 in the morning. All the other clocks in my workshop had stopped too. They sat there with their hands stuck in that same position, as if someone had pressed a giant pause button across every device in the room. The second hands didn't budge. I blinked a few times and waited for something to move, but everything remained frozen. My skin prickled and I felt a damp on my forehead. I wiped the sweat away with the back of my hand. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I'm a watchmaker. I repair clocks, I fix wrists, watches, and I build custom pieces. Most of my clients bring me old clocks they found in their grandparents' attics or stopwatches that have sentimental value. I've spent years listening to the rhythmic ticking in my workshop while I work through the night, mostly because I enjoy the quiet. That night I was trying to finish a restoration project for a customer who wanted it done by the weekend. I had taken a break to stretch my legs and get some water, and when I came back I checked the time on the large grandfather clock near the door. It read 3:33. Then I looked at the wall clock on my left. It also read 333. At first I thought it was a coincidence. Then I glanced at the vintage pocket watch on my workbench and saw the same time. My stomach clenched. I reached for a small digital clock I sometimes keep in a drawer for accuracy checks. I turned it on and the screen lit up. It showed 333. I felt a chill on my neck, so I looked behind me. No one was there. The air felt thick. I heard my own breathing, rough and uneven. I placed the digital clock next to me. I tapped it a few times and it didn't change. I listened for any ticks or mechanical sounds from the other clocks in the room. I heard nothing. It was complete silence, as if the workshop was sealed in a bubble. Even the usual hum from the old fridge in the corner seemed gone. I turned around in a slow circle, checking each clock. Every dial showed the exact same moment and nothing moved forward. The workshop looked normal under the overhead lights. Tools were spread out across my main bench: small screwdrivers, tweezers, cotton gloves, a polishing cloth, and a few clock gears. I saw my metal stool, my half-finished mug of coffee, and my open toolbox. Nothing else seemed strange, but I couldn't ignore the time. I felt my chest tighten, my mouth went dry. I waited for something to happen. My eyes darted around, trying to catch any sign of movement. That was when I noticed a shift in the corner of my vision. Near the shelf of old clocks I keep for spare parts, it wasn't a person, and it wasn't a shadow cast by anything I recognized. It moved between the clocks, sliding from one edge of the shelf to the other. It looked dark and shapeless, but it had a texture like smoke twisting in the air. I froze. My legs felt weak, but I forced them to move closer to that corner. I wanted to see if I was losing my mind. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. When I reached the shelf, the shape was gone. I stood there scanning the space between the clocks, trying to find a sign of movement, but I saw nothing. I could feel a slight tremor in my hands. The air around me felt colder now. I turned back to check the clocks again, still 333. I didn't understand how every single piece could stop at the exact same time. Even broken clocks usually show different hours. Then I heard a soft whisper, like someone mumbling under their breath. I spun around and faced the far side of the workshop near my storeroom door. I didn't see anyone, but the whispering continued. It was too faint to make out words. My breath came in quick bursts, and I could sense my heartbeat in my fingertips. I took a few steps toward the storeroom. The whispering grew a little louder, but I still couldn't tell what it was saying. Then it stopped. I stood there wondering if I should turn off the lights and search the place. I decided against it. I didn't want to be in the dark with whatever that was. I already felt cornered. I hurried to the front of the workshop, unlocked the door, and stepped outside. I took a few deep breaths of the night air. It was cool on my face, and it smelled of wet pavement and distant traffic. I glanced at my cell phone. The screen showed 334. That made my stomach knot up again. My phone showed 334, but inside the workshop everything was stuck at 333. I backed away from the entrance, letting the door close behind me. My arms were shaking. I stood there for a minute or two until I calmed down. Then I forced myself to go back inside. When I returned, the clocks all showed 334. The second hands were moving again. The ticking sound came back in full force, like someone had unmuted the entire room. I let out a shaky sigh and rubbed my temples. I asked myself if I had imagined the whole thing, but the feeling in my stomach told me I hadn't. My face felt clammy, and I needed to sit down for a moment. I went to my stool and slumped onto it. The clocks kept ticking normally. After that, I kept checking the time every few seconds until 4 o'clock in the morning, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I locked up and went home. The next night, I stayed in my workshop again. I wanted to see if it would happen at the same time. I worked on a small mantle clock, replacing some gears and adjusting the chimes. Around 3, I started to feel uneasy. My body tensed up and I felt a heaviness on my shoulders. I watched the minutes pass. 328,329,330. My hands began to sweat. At 3:40 I heard one of the clocks make a strange clicking sound. I looked up. The clock near my bench had stopped. The second hand was frozen on the 12. Then I noticed the rest of the clocks freezing as well, one after Another at 3:33. Everything stopped again. I felt a wave of dread, but I also felt a strange curiosity. I stood up slowly and walked around the workshop. I reached out and touched one of the stopped clocks on the wall. It felt normal to me, just cold metal and glass. I tapped the glass face, but the hands didn't move. Then the whispering started again. This time behind me. I spun around and saw the same dark shape gliding near my workbench. It moved from the bench to the corner by the door. I couldn't see any features on it. It looked like a thick shadow that stayed close to the floor. My heart pounded and I leaned back against the wall, feeling the rough paint on my arms. This time I heard the whispers more clearly. They sounded like voices overlapping each other, but they were quiet and fast. I recognized a few phrases that cut through the noise. Wasted moments, one said. Another said, hours you'll never get back. I felt my chest tighten more. I remembered times in my life when I had procrastinated on important things. I remembered losing track of time on meaningless distractions. These thoughts hit me quickly, one after another, like a punch in the gut. My breathing grew shallow, and I had trouble focusing my eyes. The shape moved closer, and the voices grew louder. I wanted to run, but my legs felt anchored to the ground. I forced myself to take a step toward the shape. I didn't have a plan, but I wanted to show I wasn't just going to hide. My knees felt weak, but I managed to shuffle forward. The voices paused for a second as if they noticed me. Then they started again, whispering things about tasks I had left unfinished and projects I had abandoned. My hand shook. I couldn't think of anything to say. The shape flickered and slid across the floor toward the shelf with the spare parts. It moved behind the shelf and disappeared. I heard the ticking of the clocks return slowly, 1 second at a time. I looked up and saw the second hands begin to move. I checked the wall clock. It was 3:34 again. That's how it continued for days. Each night at 3:33 my workshop would fall silent. I tried staying outside before that time, but I felt drawn to be inside the moment it happened. It was like I needed to see if there was a chance I could figure out how to stop it. I brought in a new digital timer, but it froze along with everything else. I tried recording the moment on my phone, but the video feed always froze at 3:33 as well. When the clock started again, the video picked up as if nothing unusual had happened. Every time I saw those shadowy figures moving among the clocks. Some nights I counted 3 or 4 of them. Other nights I only saw 1 or 2. They whispered about missed opportunities or lost chances. Sometimes I heard them say my name in a low hiss. My heart would race and I'd break into a cold sweat. I sometimes felt shaky for hours afterward. I drank a lot of coffee to stay alert, but it didn't stop my hands from trembling. I tried ignoring them. I put on headphones one night, blasting music to drown out the whispers. At 3:33 the music cut off. The headphones went dead. I heard the whispers behind me, but I refused to turn around. I forced myself to look at the bench in front of me, even though my mind screamed at me to run. My skin burned with tension and my mouth went dry. After a minute I felt something brush against my shoulder. I leapt off my stool and yanked off the headphones. The shadow stood right next to me, shifting on the floor. I felt my stomach lurch and I stumbled away, nearly tripping on my toolbox. Then the ticking started again and it vanished. I stayed slumped on the floor for a few minutes, trying to breathe normally. I began sleeping in short bursts during the day, showing up at the workshop around midnight. I couldn't face customers the same way. I looked tired and jumpy, and I had trouble focusing on repairs. I kept messing up simple tasks like aligning watch hands or oiling the gear trains. One evening I decided to lock myself in the workshop from midnight to dawn. Determined to get some evidence, I set up multiple cameras in different corners. I used a few older digital cameras that could record continuously. I placed them on tripods, pointing them at the main wall clock, the shelf and the workbench. I started recording around 2:50 in the morning, checking each camera to make sure it was working. I sat at my bench waiting for 3:33. When the time came, everything froze again. I heard the cameras stop worrying. I tried to see if any lights on them were still blinking, but they had all locked up. The shadow shapes appeared, drifting around the workshop like they owned the place. The whispers filled the air. They repeated things about my past choices and how much time I'd lost. I felt a knot in my throat. I tried not to react, but I couldn't help trembling. I kept my eyes on one shape in particular. As it slid across the wall, it seemed to sense I was watching it. Stopped and turned in my direction. I didn't see any eyes, but I felt its attention on me. My chest tightened and I clenched my fists. I wanted to yell, but I couldn't get any words out. My mouth just opened and closed without sound. After about a minute, the clock started up again and the cameras resumed recording. I checked the footage on each one. Nothing showed up. It was just normal footage of me sitting at my bench, then a skip at 333, and then me sitting again. No shadows, no whispers. It was like I had made it all up, but I knew I hadn't. Over time, I tried different tricks. I changed the bulbs in the workshop to see if a different kind of light would help me see them better. I moved the clocks around. I tried setting alarms before 333 to break the pattern. Nothing worked. The clocks always froze and the shadows always showed up. They whispered about time I had wasted or forgotten. They never hurt me physically, but they left me shaking and uneasy. One night I heard them whisper something new. We watch and we wait. That sent chills through my arms. My hands turned clammy. I kept glancing around, worried they might try something else, but they never did. They just whispered and drifted, then disappeared. When the clock started moving again at 3:34. Now I still work here every night. I've gotten used to the pattern. I don't understand it, but I can't walk away from the workshop. I need to make a living and I don't want to abandon my tools, so I stay and I face the same moment over and over. Each time I hear those whispers, I feel my heart thud in my chest. Sometimes I want to close my eyes until it's over, but I can't help staring at the shapes, hoping to catch some detail that might explain what's going on. I've never found a clue at this point. I accept that something strange happens every night at 3:33. All the clocks stop and those shadows show up. They whisper about my past. They remind me of the time I've spent on trivial tasks. They speak of minutes and hours I can't get back. I still don't know how to stop them or whether they'll ever go away. I just know I can't pretend they aren't real. If I try to ignore them, they come closer. If I watch them, they keep their distance. And when 3:34 arrives, they vanish, leaving me alone with the ticking of clocks that suddenly feel too loud. That's the story of what happens in my workshop. I've gone through it night after night, feeling my pulse hammer every time I keep fixing clocks and watches for my clients because I don't know what else to do. Nothing in my life explains why this is happening, but I live with it each night. When the clock hits 3:33, I hold my breath and wait for those shapes to appear, and they always do, creeping around my workshop and reminding me of the moments that slip through my fingers. Then time starts moving again and I go on working. I don't know if it will ever stop, but I keep coming back here, waiting and listening, trying to keep my hand steady while the shadows tell me what I already know. I can't escape those missing minutes and I can't rewind the clock. I remember the morning I moved into the cabin. I was tired from the long drive. My back felt stiff and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I had only one goal in mind: finish my novel without distractions. The cabin stood at the end of a narrow dirt road surrounded by tall trees on all sides. The wooden exterior looked old but sturdy. Inside there was a main room with a small fireplace, a kitchen with worn countertops, and a bedroom with a single bed. I brought enough groceries for 2 weeks. There was no internet and no cell reception, which suited me just fine. I needed the isolation. I spent the first day cleaning up dust and cobwebs. I unpacked my laptop, my notes, and my printed draft. I set them on a little table near the window in the main room. The table was shaky, but it was the only decent surface. I noticed the quiet right away. No cars, no voices, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional creak from the trees. It felt refreshing. I thought I would write with more focus than I'd had in a long time. That first night I sat at the table for hours trying to rework a crucial scene in my novel. I wrote paragraph after paragraph, stopping every few minutes to read them back. The only sounds were the scratch of my pen on paper and my own breathing. When it got too late, I closed my laptop, stacked my notes, and placed the printed pages on top. Then I went to bed. I slept restlessly. The cabin was darker than any place I'd slept before. I heard the wind outside. Sometimes the rafters made groaning sounds like the wood was shifting. My hands felt cold and I pulled the blanket tighter around me. My mind wouldn't settle, but eventually I drifted off. In the morning I woke to faint light coming through the small window in the bedroom. My head ADHD, but I was hungry, so I got up to make breakfast. The floorboards creaked under my feet. After making coffee and some toast, I sat down to review what I'd done the night before. My printed pages were neatly stacked just how I'd left them, but when I read the first page I noticed something off. 2 sentences I didn't remember writing were there in the middle of a paragraph. The style was a little sharper, more precise. The meaning was the same, but the words were different. I rubbed my eyes and read it again. I thought maybe I was so tired that I'd forgotten my own edits. I shrugged it off, drank my coffee, and decided to keep going. I opened my laptop to see the digital version of my chapter. The changes weren't in the file, they were only on the printed pages. I told myself I must have made the edits manually before bed and forgot. I didn't feel certain about that, but I moved on. The rest of the day I wrote a new chapter and tried not to dwell on it. My progress felt slow and my hands got cramped from typing too much. I walked around the cabin a few times to stretch. Each time I stepped onto the porch I felt the cold air on my face. The trees seemed to close in around the cabin, and I noticed how thick the trunks were. The sky looked grey and heavy. I went back inside and got back to work. That night I was more tired than usual. I saved my file, placed my new printed pages on top of my stack, and left my notes out again. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed. I heard a faint dripping in the sink, but I was too worn out to do anything about it. When I fell asleep I dreamed about the same chapter 1 was working on, but I don't remember the details. The next morning I woke up with a slight pain in my shoulders. I walked into the main room feeling a chill that made my skin prickle. I switched on the overhead light and saw my stack of pages had been rearranged. At first I thought maybe I had left them crooked, but when I picked them up I saw entire paragraphs written in a different style. My handwriting hadn't changed. These paragraphs were typed matching my usual font and spacing, but they had phrases I never typed. Certain details were more vivid. The dialogue between my characters had better pacing, and every scene had an undercurrent of tension that I didn't remember adding. It was impressive work, but it felt more hostile, more bleak. The focus was sharper, like the story had turned darker overnight. My chest tightened and my jaw clenched. I couldn't figure out how it happened. I looked around the cabin, checking the locked Door and the windows, everything was shut tight. Nobody could have snuck in. The place felt empty. I stood there for a while just staring at those pages. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then I sat down and compared the files on my laptop to the printed pages. None of these new edits appeared on my screen. It was as if the changes happened outside my computer. I tried not to panic. I told myself it was a sign that I was working too hard. Maybe I was rewriting my pages while half asleep and not remembering. I decided to test it. I printed the pages again from my laptop and left them in a separate folder. Then I put the existing edited pages on the table along with my notes. I wanted to see if the same changes would appear on the fresh printouts or just on the original ones. I also set up my phone to record a video overnight. Even though I had barely any battery left, I hoped to catch something, maybe myself sleepwalking. That evening I cooked some canned soup on the small stove. The taste was bland, but it filled me up. The temperature had dropped. My breath felt cold in front of my face, so I lit a small fire in the fireplace. The crackling of the wood relaxed me. I tried to keep calm by reading one of my old writing guides. I managed to stay awake until midnight. Then I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I shut the fire down, left my papers on the table as planned, and put my phone in the corner. Aimed at the table, I went to the bedroom and collapsed onto the bed without even changing clothes. The next morning I woke up with a start. My heart was pounding and my hands felt clammy. I walked to the main room and the first thing I saw was the table. The printed pages on top had fresh changes again. Words were crossed out or replaced entire. Sentences were rearranged for better impact. The writing still looked like my style, but polished to an eerie degree. Even the new printouts I'd left in the separate folder had a few changes. They weren't as extensive, but there were enough to show it wasn't a fluke. Some lines were revised to reflect a gloomier tone. I grabbed my phone to check the recording. The battery was dead. I cursed under my breath and plugged it into the wall. Once it had enough charge, I watched the video. For the first few hours nothing happened. It was just the dimly lit table and my blanketed shape in the distance as I wandered around before bed around 2 a.m. The screen went dark for a second, like the phone glitched. Then the recording resumed and I could see the table again, but there was a gap of about a minute. No sign of anyone in the room. The pages looked undisturbed on camera. The last few hours just showed the same empty room with no movement. I saw no person turning pages or typing. It made my stomach twist in knots. I noticed the new edits reference facts about my personal life. Parts of the text hinted at regrets or mistakes I'd made. It felt like the story was becoming a direct commentary on my past, and it was becoming more unsettling by the day. Every time I read these new lines, I felt my chest tighten and my throat go dry. The writing was good, but it felt invasive. I tried to stay logical. I thought maybe I'd brought old memories into my story. Maybe my subconscious was playing tricks on me. So I decided to sleep during the day and work at night. I figured if something was happening in the dark, I should be awake to see it. The first day I tried this, I closed the curtains and blocked any sunlight from coming in. I lay down on the bed with a blanket over my head, but I couldn't rest. My thoughts kept circling. After a few hours I got up and realized I had barely dozed off. I splashed cold water on my face, then brewed coffee. My limbs felt heavy, but I forced myself to write from late afternoon until sunrise at around 3 a.m. and I started to feel dizzy. My eyes stung and my neck felt tight. I stepped outside on the porch to get some fresh air. The night sky was clear, but there was no moonlight. I heard branches swaying. The cabin looked even more isolated in the dark. I stood there for a few minutes, then went back inside to keep working. By 5 a.m. I had a solid chunk of new writing. I felt almost proud of myself for staying awake. My phone was charging on the kitchen counter, filming the table again, but from a different angle. I sat in the same room sipping coffee and reading over my new pages. I didn't see anything strange happened in front of me. No footsteps, no flickering lights. It was just quiet at night, and I felt a bit foolish for worrying so much. At around 6 a.m. I stepped outside again. Dawn was starting to break. I walked a few yards away from the cabin to stretch my legs. I felt the morning chill on my face. My back cracked when I twisted around. I took a deep breath, listened to the wind, and tried to clear my mind. When I returned to the cabin, I went straight to the table. Nothing looked different at first, then I realized one page in the middle was out of alignment. I lifted the stack and saw new words added to a scene I just finished an hour ago. They were comments about my own life, about a past relationship I'd ended badly. It was the same type of detail that had no place in my fictional story. My stomach churned, my pulse throbbed in my temples. I checked the phone's recording right away. I saw myself leaving the cabin around 6 a.m. Then the camera glitched for a split second. When it came back, I was already walking in the door again. The pages never moved on screen. No hand touched them, no figure appeared, but the words were there. At that point, I started to feel trapped. My days blurred together. Each morning, more changes showed up in my pages. The story kept veering into darker territory. It hinted at secrets I had never planned to reveal. Private moments from my past found their way into my characters' dialogue. My mouth felt dry whenever I read them. I tried copying the entire revised text back into my laptop files, hoping to take control, but the next day something else changed. Now the story's focus seemed to shift toward my own isolation in the cabin. It read like a personal journal. The tone was bleak. It described the tension I felt every night, like it was narrating my exact situation. My hands would tremble as I turned the pages. I started to worry that I was losing my mind. I tried to call a friend from the city, but I had no reception. I thought about driving to a gas station to make a call, but part of me felt compelled to stay. I had come here to finish my novel, and I was strangely fascinated by these edits. They were better than anything I'd come up with. Even though they unsettled me, they improved the flow of the narrative. I felt torn between fear and curiosity. Every night I pushed myself to stay awake. I drank coffee until my stomach hurt. I paced around the main room, listening to the wood floors creak under my steps. I stared at the walls, expecting something to appear. Nothing did, yet every morning more changes awaited me. My heart would pound and my mouth would go dry when I read them. After a few days of that, I started getting paranoid. I checked every corner of the cabin, including the tiny attic space I could barely reach. By standing on a chair, I found nothing. No footprints, no personal belongings that weren't mine, no hidden devices. I even examined the underside of the table for any clues. There was only dusty wood. My phone never captured any intruder. There was only that single moment of glitch. Each time it felt like something was messing with me. The worst part was that the new edits kept moving away from the original plot of my novel. The text focused on my regrets, my guilt, and my anxieties. It described events from my past in detail, as though I were a character in my own story. It all felt shameful. My chest felt tight whenever I read those sections, like I wanted to look away but couldn't. I started ripping pages out. I wanted to stop the changes from creeping further into my work, but the next day there they were again, reprinted and reorganized on fresh sheets. Each time the writing got more direct, more personal, pointing out flaws I'd tried to forget. I felt exposed. My palms Sweated whenever I touched those pages. One afternoon, after another sleepless night, I decided to destroy all physical copies. I went outside and set up a small fire in a metal trash can near the cabin side wall. I tossed all my printed pages in, including the newly edited versions. I watched them curl up and turn black. The heat on my face felt overwhelming. My hands shook as the flame consumed the paper. I felt a small burst of relief. Then I went back inside and locked the door. I opened my laptop to find my original version, hoping I could salvage what I had before things got out of control. At first everything looked normal. My older text was still there. Then I checked the file properties. The date modified was the day before. My heart sank. I opened the file and the final chapters had the same disturbing changes. They were now embedded in my digital version. Lines about my personal life were woven throughout. My muscles tensed and I almost slammed the laptop shut. I felt my chest tighten like I couldn't breathe. I tried deleting the passages right there, but an error message popped up. It said the file was in use even though no other program was open. I tried again, same message. I restarted the laptop, but it refused to reboot. The screen went dark and I couldn't turn it on again. The battery had been at 40%, yet now it was dead. I stared at the black screen, feeling my hands tremble. I took a few shaky breaths, then looked around the cabin. The sun was starting to set. The trees outside looked darker. I felt trapped and uncertain. I didn't know how these changes were happening, and I couldn't stop them. There was no sense of finality, just a lingering dread. I had come here to finish my novel, but I realized something else was at work. Something wanted me to face my own life in a story I never intended to write. I stood up, grabbed my car keys, and walked to the door. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, and looked back at the table. The cabin was silent, and the last bits of light through the window made the inside look dim and uneven. My heart was pounding, and my ears felt hot. I thought about staying one more night to see if the writing would continue to change, but my hand shook and my mouth felt dry. I wasn't sure. I wanted to find out. I left the cabin without turning back. I don't know what I'll do with the pages I burned or the file on my dead laptop. I just know that every time I think about that cabin, my neck feels stiff and I feel the urge to run. I came there to write a novel, but something else wrote a darker version of my story. It wrote about me in ways I never expected, and even though I tried to destroy it, I still feel that story waiting somewhere unfinished and ready to change again. I noticed the first strange detail on a Tuesday night. I had just come home from a long day of teaching. I remember dropping my briefcase by the living room couch, then going to the kitchen to get a glass of water. When I came back, I thought I saw my coffee mug on the table shifted a couple of inches to the right. It didn't make sense. I had placed it near the corner of the table the night before, and I was sure I'd left it in a precise spot. I have a habit of remembering positions of items in my home because I live alone and I don't like anything out of place. I decided it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe I bumped the table earlier. I shrugged it off. I didn't think about it again until the next morning. I was late for a lecture, and as I dashed out the door I saw a thick psychology textbook on my shelf, tilted at an awkward angle. I keep my books perfectly lined up. They're usually flush with the edge of the shelf and I never tilt them, but this one was definitely off by an inch or so. I stared at it for a few seconds, my stomach feeling tight for no clear reason. I was in a hurry, so I didn't fix it. I just stood there feeling a quick rush of unease. Then I left. Over the next few days I started noticing more tiny details. A picture on the wall looked slightly crooked. A throw pillow on my couch wasn't where I left it. A coaster on the coffee table was missing. Later I found it under the table, angled in a weird way against the leg I walked around my apartment at. night trying to remember if I'd done any of it myself. I wondered if I'd carried a book to the couch and left the coaster on the floor. I couldn't recall doing that. I felt a small jolt in my chest every time I saw something out of place. My job involves focusing on human behavior and memory, yet I was baffled by these changes in my own environment. I decided to take action. I set up a system every night before going to bed. I walked through each room with my phone and took pictures. I made sure to capture the positions of every object on my shelves, counters and tables. I even snapped a picture of each frame on the walls. Then in the morning I would compare the photos with what I actually saw in the apartment. On the first night of this routine, I spent over an hour taking pictures. I realized it was a bit obsessive, but I wanted evidence. I teach psychology. I've seen how the mind can misinterpret things, especially under stress. I wanted a clear record. The next morning I woke up feeling alert. My heart pounded a little as I picked up my phone to review the pictures. I compared them with each room. At first everything looked the same. My nightstand lamp was in the same spot. My alarm clock faced me at the correct angle. But then I walked into the living room. I saw that my favorite coffee mug, which I had placed on the edge of the kitchen counter the night before, was now in the sink. I felt a chill. I flipped through my photos. The picture from the night before showed the mug on the counter handle pointing toward the stove. Now it sat in the sink empty, a few drops of water inside. I had no memory of moving it. I checked my phone's camera roll again, looking for anything I might have missed. Nothing explained the shift. At that point I felt a lump in my throat. I was alone and nobody had a key to my apartment. Nobody had been over. I locked the door every night. I still do. I went to work with a heavy feeling in my gut. I tried to teach my students about cognitive biases and memory distortions, but my mind drifted to my own situation. The question wouldn't go away. Who moved that mug? That same evening I returned home determined to check every corner. The door was locked. Nothing looked out of place in the hallway. I stepped into the living room. My eyes darted around the furniture. Everything looked normal. I checked the pictures again. I matched objects with their positions. Nothing had moved, at least as far as I could tell, but I felt uneasy, like there was someone behind me. I turned around a few times expecting to see something or someone. I saw nothing. I told myself to calm down. I took a deep breath, drank some water and tried to relax. I repeated my routine of taking pictures before bed. Days passed. A few items still seemed shifted in small ways, but then an odd pattern started to emerge. I realized the pictures from previous nights didn't match my memory of those nights. I'd look at a photo, see a pen lying across my desk and think that's not how I remember it, but the photo was there, undeniable. Over time I noticed that the objects weren't changing. Instead, my recollection of how they had been arranged was changing. That discovery hit me hard. I reviewed picture after picture, trying to find differences between consecutive days. In many cases the items stayed in the exact same SP spot, but my memory told me a different story. My brain told me they had moved. The proof, however, said otherwise. I sat on my couch late one night flipping through these images, my heart pounding in my ears. My hands trembled. There was a nauseating feeling in my stomach. I thought, am I losing my mind? Am I experiencing early dementia? I didn't want to consider that option, but I also didn't see another explanation. I spent more time at home than usual, skipping social events and some optional faculty gatherings. I started double-checking everything I did. If I moved a chair, I'd take a picture. If I opened a drawer, I'd note the contents. My phone was filling up with countless photos of my ordinary apartment. I began to wonder if I was simply stressed. Maybe I was overworked, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something else was going on. I felt restless at night. I woke up sweaty with My heart racing. I sometimes heard faint noises in the hallway or in the living room. I'd get out of bed, phone in hand, and I'd find nothing, no signs of an intruder, just an uneasy feeling hanging in the air. My mind wandered to the possibility of some external force, but there was no evidence for that. The evidence pointed to a different truth. My memories were shifting somehow. At one point I remembered a strange detail from my childhood, but the memory felt fragile, and the next day I couldn't recall it clearly. The memory of that memory seemed to fade. I became concerned about repressed trauma or something along those lines. I had studied these phenomena academically, but I never expected to experience them personally. It was unsettling to consider that my own recollections were unreliable. I decided to organize all my notes and photos on my laptop. I created folders labeled with dates and times. I tried to see if there was a connection between the shifts in my memory and certain triggers. I looked for patterns involving stress, sleep quality, or even diet. Nothing stood out, but as I examined everything, I started noticing a timeline. The objects I thought were moving were linked to certain personal items. A few were old gifts from friends, some were items from my office, but a majority were things related to my life before I became a professor. There was an old book from my undergraduate days, a picture frame I got when I was 20, a coffee mug I used in grad school. Every time I noticed a supposed shift, it involved one of these older possessions. I tried to push deeper, asking myself what these items might represent. I recalled events from my late teens and early 20s. There was a gap in my memory surrounding a certain summer. I didn't like thinking about that summer, but I couldn't recall why. My head started hurting whenever I tried to piece it together. I saw flashes of an old apartment. I felt an odd pressure in my chest when I pictured it, then I'd lose the memory again. Late one night I looked at an old photograph of myself standing with two friends at a campus event. My hand shook as I held the photo. I recognized the grin on my face, but couldn't remember who took the picture. I was certain it was from that summer. I stared at the date stamp. There was something about that time period that made me feel a sudden jolt of fear. My breathing became shallow. I had to set the photo down. I started noticing more changes in my memory. I'd forget where I put my phone or my wallet, then I'd find them in the most obvious places, but I had no recollection of putting them there. My heart would race every time it happened. I felt a cool sweat on my forehead when I realized I wasn't just mixing up object positions, I was losing track of my own actions. One evening I sat at my desk in the living room, staring at a blinking cursor on my laptop screen. My plan was to write down everything I could remember about that summer and see if the process helped me recall the missing event. I typed maybe 2 sentences before I felt a sudden headache. My jaw tightened. I heard my phone buzz, but a colleague who specializes in memory disorders, but I hesitated. Admitting I might be losing control felt humiliating. I kept stalling, convincing myself I could handle it alone. I tried one more strategy. One, recorded myself speaking. I set up my phone on my living room table and talked about my day, describing every routine detail. I did this late in the evening, right before taking the photos of the apartment. I said where I placed objects, what I ate, how I felt. I let the phone record my words. Then I went to bed feeling a headache creep in as I tried not to think too hard. The next morning I played back the recording. I listened to myself listing off the positions of objects. I heard my own tired voice. Then I compared it to the photos. Everything matched. The mug was in the sink just like I said in the recording, but my memory told me I put it on the table. My chest felt tight as I realized I had literal proof of me saying the mug was in the sink, yet my mind insisted otherwise. At this point I focused on that gap in my past again. I spread out old photos on my coffee table. I grouped them by approximate date. My chest felt heavy as I stared at certain pictures, my hands shook and I could feel my breathing speed up. Images of an old apartment in a rundown building filled my mind. I could picture paint peeling from the walls, a single lamp on a small table. I remembered the smell of cigarettes in the hallway, but I never smoked. I remembered a loud argument, my voice raised, and someone else's voice too. I felt my heart pound, then everything went blank. The memory ended there. I realized something about my current situation might be tied to that missing piece of my life. I had buried it or blocked it out. Now it felt like my brain was pushing it back to the surface, but in a twisted way. It was messing with my sense of reality to get my attention, so I made a decision. I shut off all distractions. I turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and sat on my couch with a single lamp on. I went through each photo from that summer, forcing myself to focus. I felt sharp pains in my head. I pushed through it slowly. I got pieces of the memory back. I remembered a personal crisis, a betrayal by someone I trusted, and a week when I barely slept or ate. I remembered feeling desperate. I recalled leaving that apartment in a rush, carrying a single suitcase. My old possessions stayed behind. As these details returned, I felt an odd sense of relief and terror at the same time. My heart pounded, my mouth felt dry, but my head cleared a bit. I realized I had never fully processed that period. I had locked it away. Now, faced with these subtle memory shifts, I understood that my mind was forcing me to address it. It wasn't a supernatural event or an intruder. It was my brain trying to reconnect loose threads. In that moment, I grasped that I wasn't insane. My body trembled with adrenaline, but I felt a small spark of calm. I sat there for a long time looking at the old photographs. I breathed slowly and let the memory settle. I decided to reach out to a therapist friend, someone I trusted, to discuss what was happening. I didn't know if the memory shifts would stop right away. I didn't know if I would have more flashes of the past, but I felt less afraid. I understood there was a cause, and it wasn't something external. I closed my laptop and gathered the photos into a neat stack. I stood up, feeling a slight ache in my back from sitting so long. I glanced at my living room. Everything looked steady. The furniture was in place. The mug was exactly where I left it. My phone was where I remembered placing it. The world felt stable again. Even if my mind needed more time to heal, I knew I'd still document everything, at least for a while. But the panic had eased. My mind wasn't betraying me, it was pushing me. That thought gave me the tiniest bit of reassurance. I walked to my bedroom, switched off the light, and crawled under the covers. My heart was still beating fast, but I felt more grounded. I closed my eyes and drifted off, aware that I was on the edge of a long journey, and I was ready to face it. I got the night guard job at the art museum about 8 months ago. It was a way to earn extra money while still having most of my days free. I liked the calm atmosphere at night. I could walk through those quiet halls and feel a certain peace. The biggest problems we usually had were alarm malfunctions or someone forgetting to lock a storage closet. I never saw anything strange or felt unsettled at all, but 1 month ago everything changed. It began with one painting, and now I can't stop thinking about it. I feel my stomach twist whenever I remember the first time I noticed something off. I'm not a person who imagines things or jumps at shadows. I'm pretty level-headed, but what I saw made my scalp tingle and my heart beat so fast that my chest felt tight. I want to explain how this started. I was doing my usual round. The main gallery is on the 2nd floor, and it has several small rooms connected by corridors. One of these rooms has a single painting on each wall, all from the same artist. They're all portraits. Most people walk right past them because they're not as famous as the paintings in the main hall. They feature people in old-fashioned clothes with expressions that range from bored to blank. I never spent much time looking at them, but that night I stopped because something drew my eye to the portrait in the far corner. It showed a man with a stern face and dark eyes. He wore a black jacket and had one hand resting on a small table. I remember reading the little sign next to it once. It said something about the painting being from the late 1800s. I didn't pay too much attention to the name. That first night I noticed that the man's body seemed a bit angled. His torso looked turned more than I remembered, like he was leaning to one side. I thought maybe I was mixing it up with another painting, or that the lighting was different. We'd had some bulbs replaced earlier, and sometimes the shadows made things appear strange. I shrugged it off. I looked closer, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. The figure was still in the middle, but something about his posture seemed different. I didn't feel any panic then. I just felt curious. I walked away thinking I might be tired or overthinking. The next night I went to that room around midnight. Usually I check all the galleries twice before I settle at my station near the entrance. This time I went straight to that painting. I stood in front of it and stared. The man looked like he had moved his left shoulder even closer to the frame. I told myself it was impossible. A painting doesn't shift around. My pulse sped up and I took out my phone. I snapped a picture, then I compared it to an image I found online. When I searched the museum's collection page, the online photo showed the man facing forward, no angle, no tilt. My phone photo seemed to show the same. I looked at my phone screen carefully, but it matched the original. I felt a chill along my arms because I was sure I saw the shift just a second ago, but the photo didn't lie right. I walked out of that room and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I sat in the security office for a while, scanning the cameras. Everything looked normal. Eventually I convinced myself that maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I was tired, and the difference was so small that it might have been my imagination. Still, when my shift ended, I kept thinking about it. By the time I got home, I was half sure I'd made it up, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. Over the following nights, I found myself drawn back to that room over and over. Each time I felt my heart pick up a beat. It wasn't a sudden jump scare, it was more like a slow creep of dread. I'd walk in and see that painting, and I swear the man's figure in the portrait had inched closer to the right edge. Sometimes it looked like he was turning his head just slightly. Other times his eyes seemed to have shifted focus. One night I noticed his hand looked higher on the table, but every time I took a picture it appeared exactly like the original. The man facing forward with a neutral expression and a hand resting calmly on the table's surface. I kept this to myself for a few nights. I didn't want my coworkers to think I was losing it, but eventually I told Marcus, who worked the shift after me. He laughed and said I must be bored. He looked at the painting with me one afternoon when we overlapped for about half an hour. He said it looked completely normal and that maybe I was focusing too hard on one detail. I tried to let it go, but I couldn't. Each night that painting seemed more off than before. I started feeling a knot in my throat whenever I opened the door to that small gallery room. One night I decided to set up my phone on video mode. I wanted to capture any movement. I placed it on a small table in the corner and let it record for about 10 minutes. I stood there, arms crossed, eyes on the painting. I didn't see anything move in real time. I didn't notice a shift or a flicker. It just hung there. After 10 minutes, I looked at my phone. When I played back the footage, the painting looked exactly the same the whole time, no changes at all. I felt a wave of frustration. My mind felt tangled. I was sure something was happening, but I had no proof. I became more uneasy every time I passed that painting. I got a small jolt of adrenaline in my chest. My face grew hot and my fingers tensed. I started Sweating more during my rounds, my uniform got damp around my collar. I found myself dreading that room, but I couldn't stay away. It was like I had to confirm what was going on or confirm that I was losing my mind. My stomach churned with dread whenever I turned the corner toward that portrait. After about 2 weeks of this, I thought the figure in the painting was almost touching the edge of the frame. I could see the man's shoulder near the right border. The table was at a slight angle and his hand seemed closer to the wooden edge. At that point I tried something different. I asked the museum's curator Deborah to come look at the painting in the afternoon during regular hours. She was busy, but after some convincing she agreed to meet me in that room. I watched her study the portrait. She looked at the sign, looked at the painting, and said everything appeared normal. I pointed out the angle of the man's torso. She shrugged and said that's how the painting always was. Then I asked if she had any older photos. She took me to the artist's office, where we found some old catalogs. We found one image from 30 years ago. It looked just like it does online. The man in the center slightly turned, but not as extreme as what I was seeing at night. But Deborah insisted it was the same. I stared at the black and white print and felt the hairs on my neck stand up because I swore it looked different from what I was seeing in person, but she couldn't see any difference that night. I felt more on edge than ever. I got to that room around 11:30 p.m. I set my flashlight down on a bench and just looked at the painting. The longer I stared, the more certain I was that the man in the painting was now leaning so far to the side he almost looked like he was stepping out of the frame. I couldn't see any paint strokes out of place, but the entire form was shifted. My breathing got shallow. I felt a tremble in my legs. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. I wiped sweat from my forehead and took my phone out again. I snapped another picture. I checked it right away. It looked like the standard version with no sign of the shift. I felt a wave of frustration that made me want to throw my phone across the room, but I controlled myself and put it back in my pocket. I stayed in that room for an hour just pacing and looking at the painting. I thought maybe I would see it move if I stared long enough, but nothing happened while I watched. I felt a headache creeping in from the tension in my jaw. I left the room and continued my rounds. Every time I circled back, it looked a bit closer to the edge. By around 3 a.m. I thought the figure's foot was almost out of sight near the bottom. The face was turned more toward the right side. I could see the corner of his eye looking back at me. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. My arms felt shaky. I kept rubbing my palms on my pants to dry them. I wanted to call someone, but what would I say? The next morning I tried to talk to Marcus again. I told him I was getting freaked out, that I was losing sleep, and that I needed him to help me confirm something. He agreed to come early on his shift and see it for himself. At around midnight he joined me. We went to the room. I told him to look at the painting carefully. He nodded and said, "Okay, I see a man. He's in the center. He's wearing a black jacket and has a table next to him. He didn't see any unusual tilt or shift. He said it looked the same as always." I felt a wave of panic. I couldn't understand why no one else could see it. I asked him to describe it in detail. He described exactly how it appears in the official photos. That wasn't how I saw it in front of me. I felt sweat trickling down my back. My skin prickled. I tried to show him what I was seeing, pointing at the edges in the frame, but he just shook his head and told me I might need a break or some rest. 2 days later I tried a different approach. I placed small strips of tape on the wall around the painting's frame to mark reference points I wanted to see if the figure in the painting lined up differently from one night to the next, but the next morning the tape was all in the same position and there were no signs of movement on the painting. I checked the painting's edges, but there was no evidence that the canvas had physically shifted. It was exactly where it was supposed to be, at least in a measurable sense, yet my eyes told me the figure was moving. I started having trouble sleeping. Even during the day I'd lie in bed and picture that man in the painting leaning closer to the edge, his eyes fixed on me. I began to feel a constant heaviness in my chest. I felt tense all the time. I jumped at small sounds. My patience wore thin. I found myself getting anxious about going to work, but I still showed up because I needed the job, and also so a part of me needed to see if the painting would finally reach the edge. I kept telling myself maybe it was some trick, some hidden feature of the artwork that only reveals itself under certain lighting conditions, but I couldn't explain why no one else saw it. One night about a week ago, I walked into the gallery room and found the man's figure almost half out of the frame. It looked like he was trying to step out onto the floor. His hand was on the frame itself, gripping it. My stomach dropped. My heart thumped so hard it made my vision feel shaky. I stood there and a cold sweat ran down my temples. I reached out to touch the painting's surface. My hand was trembling. The canvas felt smooth and flat. I ran my fingers over the area where his hand appeared to grip the frame. It was just normal canvas. I couldn't feel any texture that matched a raised hand, but visually my eyes were telling me he was practically climbing out. I pulled my hand back and wiped my palm on my pants. I left the room, heart pounding, and stood in the hallway to catch my breath. I decided I had enough. I called the head of security, Jared, on the internal line and told him I was feeling sick. I clocked out early and went home. That was last week. I used some vacation days to stay away from the museum for a while. I just sat at home most nights trying to calm my nerves. I got a checkup with my doctor, who said I was physically fine. My blood pressure was a bit high, probably from stress. I didn't mention the painting. I didn't want them to think I was seeing things, but I still felt uneasy even at home. I kept imagining that painting in my mind. Yesterday I had to go back to work. I needed the pay. I walked into the museum around 10 p.m. My shift starts at 11 o'clock, but I like to get there a bit early. The place felt the same, but I was sweating more than usual. I went straight to that gallery. When I stepped in, I saw the painting in the corner. My eyes locked onto the figure. It was back in its normal position. The man centered, facing forward, hand on the table, no sign of the leaning or the partial escape. I stood there and stared for a long minute. My breath came out in short bursts. I felt a wave of relief, then confusion. I touched the frame. Everything looked perfectly normal. Was it over? I spent the rest of the night walking around with a lump in my throat. My heart rate never fully calmed down. I kept checking that room. The painting didn't change. It stayed in its original position, even to my eyes. I don't know if it will move again. Maybe it reached the edge while I was gone and decided to go back to the center. Maybe it never moved at all and I just experienced some strange stress-related hallucination, but I still remember the moment I saw it gripping the frame, and my skin crawls when I think of that now. Every time I pass by that small room, I feel my muscles tense, my face feels tight, my hands go clammy. I can't help but take a quick glance at the painting, expecting the man to be leaning to the side again. So far it stayed in place, but I can't shake the sense that something isn't right. I haven't told my coworkers the full story. They just know I was stressed out. I'm keeping an eye on it though. If it ever moves again, I need to see it for myself. Part of me wants to ask for a transfer to a different shift or a different section of the museum, but another part of me thinks I need To face it, I have no proof of what happened, but I can't deny how real it felt. My body reacted like it was real. My heart pounded, my palms sweated, and my breath caught in my throat. That's all I can say for sure. I don't know what to call it or how to explain it. All I know is I'll be in that gallery again tonight, waiting to see if the painting stays still or if it starts to move again, and I'm not sure which outcome I'm hoping for. I first spotted the mirror in a cramped storage garage on the edge of town. The place smelled like old leather and stale coffee, and I remember sweating through my shirt because the ventilation was awful. A local guy named Bert was auctioning off a bunch of items he'd collected over the years. Most of it was standard stuff: dusty chairs, chipped lamps, battered boxes full of records. Then I saw the mirror leaning against a rusted file cabinet. It wasn't tall, maybe up to my chest, but it had a thick wooden frame that looked scratched up in a few places. My eyes locked on it for no clear reason. I didn't see my own reflection on the surface. Instead, I just saw a dull grey shine that reminded me of tarnished metal. I walked closer and crouched in front of it. I felt this strong urge to run my fingertips over the frame. It was smooth in some parts and splintered in others, like someone had tried to sand it down but gave up halfway. The surface of the mirror looked cloudy. When I tilted my head, I could just barely make out a faint silhouette. It was the outline of a person, but it wasn't me. I blinked and leaned in until my nose almost touched the glass. That silhouette stayed in place. I stepped back and let out a slow breath. My heart thumped against my ribs. I didn't know what I was looking at, but it tugged at me. Bert saw me staring. He wandered over, cleared his throat, and said he'd sell me the mirror for a good price. He mentioned it was an old piece from some estate sale a while back, and he wanted to get rid of it because it creeped him out. I raised an EY eyebrow at him. He just shrugged and gave me a figure that was surprisingly low. I nodded, paid him in cash, and strapped the mirror into the back of my truck. I run a small antique shop, so I wasn't too worried about finding a buyer. Odd items sometimes fetch higher prices, and I figured someone out there would be interested in a mirror that had some weird vibe. I guess I didn't realize how weird it would get. Back at my store, I brought the mirror inside and propped it up against a wall behind the counter. The moment I let go of it, I felt this uneasy sensation down my spine. My shop is pretty quiet most days, except for some regulars who come in to browse. That afternoon, I had the place to myself. I locked the front door and turned back toward the mirror. Its surface had this strange shimmer. When I approached, I stood in front of it and expected to see my own face, but there was nothing. It was just a blank haze, like a thick fog on the surface. My chest felt tight. I leaned in, raising my hand to touch it. My fingers brushed the glass. It felt cold. Then the haze shifted and I saw a face. It wasn't my face as I am right now. It was a version of me with shorter hair and a slight scar above the eyebrow. That version didn't move in sync with me. He looked back at me with this hard stare as if he knew me but didn't exactly like me. I froze. My throat went dry. I pulled my hand away, but the other me pressed his palm against the inside of the mirror like a reverse image. I noticed my own hand wasn't up in the air anymore. My real arm was dangling at my side, but his was raised. My heart pounded. I heard a slight buzzing in my ears. Then, without any sound, his mouth moved. He said something, but I couldn't hear it. It was like watching someone through a soundproof window. My pulse hammered so loud I could hear it in my head. I stood there, not sure if I should run or try to understand. He mouthed the words again. I couldn't read his lips, but I could see the tension in his eyes. Then the image faded and the mirror went blank again. I swallowed and wiped sweat from my forehead. My head felt light and I grabbed a stool to sit down. After a minute or two, I got back on my feet and walked around The mirror checking the back, there was nothing unusual, just wood and a cardboard-like panel secured with small nails. I tapped it solid. I faced the front again, but now I saw my normal reflection. I looked tired, sweaty, and freaked out. I let out a shaky laugh and told myself it must have been some kind of optical trick. Maybe I was just tired from the heat, or maybe the mirror was warped in some strange way. I decided to leave the store earlier. I slid the mirror into my back office so customers wouldn't see it. I drove home, took a quick shower, and tried to forget about the whole thing. I couldn't. My hands shook every time I thought about the reflections. As I kept telling myself I'd go back in the morning and examine it more carefully. That night I barely slept. I tossed and turned every time I closed my eyes. I saw that other version of me pressing his hand against the glass. The next day I arrived at the shop before sunrise. I unlocked the door and went straight to the office. The mirror stood where I'd left it, leaning against a filing cabinet with some old receipts on top. I stared at it from a few feet away. It looked normal, just a regular antique with some scuffs around the edges. I sighed and stepped closer. The surface stayed blank for a few seconds, then another shape came into focus. This time it was me, but I looked older. My hair had streaks of grey at the temples and I was wearing a suit I've never owned. That version of me looked calm. He lifted his hand to wave, and I could see a heavy gold ring on his finger. I looked down at my own hand. No ring, no fancy suit. My breathing sped up. Then the reflection turned its head as if looking over its shoulder. The glass flickered and another version of me appeared behind him, pushing forward. That second figure tried to shove the older one out of the way. They glanced at each other with clear frustration, and I realized they were aware of each other. I heard a faint buzzing like a static sound from a television with poor reception. Their mouths moved, but again I couldn't hear a thing. They looked angry or maybe desperate. Then the mirror went white again. I took a step back, heart pounding. For a few days I tried to keep the mirror in a corner of my office covered with a sheet. I couldn't bring myself to sell it. I worried about what might happen if someone else got hold of it or discovered its strange property. My curiosity grew stronger every hour. I would catch myself staring at the sheet, wondering if those versions of me were still in there, maybe watching. At night I had trouble sleeping again. My shoulders ached from tension and my stomach felt queasy. I started to dread going to the shop, but at the same time I wanted to uncover more of what the mirror could do. On the fifth evening I stayed late. I locked the front door and switched off the main lights. Only a small lamp on my desk kept the room dimly, then motioned for me to step closer. Another reflection. This one looked as if he'd been through something rough, with a cast on his left arm, pushed forward, shaking his head at the older one. Then all three turned to see a fourth reflection appear. That fourth one looked stern and wore some kind of uniform I didn't recognize. They all started squabbling and silence, bumping shoulders as if they each wanted the front position. My stomach twisted in knots. I set my hand on the mirror's frame. My fingertips felt a tremor, like a faint vibration. I swallowed hard and leaned in. I tried to speak quietly, asking what they wanted. My throat felt scratchy and the words came out in a shaky whisper. I saw the older reflection mouth something back, then the rest of them erupted in silent protests. One of them, the one in the uniform, shoved the older reflection aside. The older reflection stumbled, which looked odd from my perspective. It reminded me of people crowding around a narrow doorway, all trying to get through. My breath came faster. My mind spun with questions. Were these versions of my future? Were they trying to push the others out so their timeline would win? I noticed the younger one in the jacket again. He pressed his hand to the glass and locked eyes with me. I felt a rush of cold flood my body. I couldn't hear him, but I Saw his mouth move in slow, deliberate shapes. It looked like he was telling me not to listen to the others. The older one saw that and shot him a furious look. I stepped back, my hands shaking. Then I heard a faint sound like glass being tapped from inside. I leaned in again, and that younger reflection was tapping on the barrier, pointing at me. His eyes looked wild. My mind raced. I couldn't figure out what to do. If these were possible futures, how was I supposed to decide who to trust? My heart thumped so hard that my chest felt compressed. I realized that maybe each reflection was fighting for a chance to be the final version of me. The older one in the suit glared at the younger one, pointing a finger in his face. The one with the cast shoved the uniformed one aside. They all acted like they had to eliminate the competition before I did something to lock one future in place. I backed away, nearly tripping over a stack of boxes. My foot twisted and I groaned, grabbing the desk for balance. My leg tingled with pain, but I stayed upright. I never took my eyes off the mirror. The reflections were now pushing and shoving each other. Their eyes were intense, fixated on me. Whenever they had a clear line of sight, my stomach churned and I felt sweat dripping down my temple. I figured I had two choices: smash the mirror or try to find a way to control it. I thought about the money I spent on it and the curiosity that had been eating at me. I decided to try something else first. I reached out and pressed both palms against the glass. My breath caught in my throat. The surface felt cold, but it also had a pulse-like vibration. The reflections froze and stared at my hands. Their eyes flicked to each other like they were waiting for the next move. I pressed hard and whispered, "I can't hear you. Show me what you want." For a second everything stayed still. Then the reflection with the cast reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He started flipping through it, showing me pages. I couldn't make out what was written, but he insisted on holding it up to the glass. The older reflection in the suit grabbed the notebook and threw it to the side. Then he reached inside his jacket and pulled out something that looked like a check or a contract. He waved it in front of the glass. The younger one in the jacket slammed his hand against the older one's wrist, knocking the paper away. They wrestled in silence while the uniformed reflection tried to wedge himself forward. I stood there pressing the glass, feeling a dull ache in my palms. My breathing got heavier. My mind felt locked in place, watching them fight for my attention. I thought about letting go and stepping away, but something inside me refused to look away. They were me in some strange sense. I wanted answers. My shoulders tightened and my eyes stung from not blinking enough. I kept watching their pantomime argument. The uniformed one glanced at me, then at the others, and pointed outside the frame as if telling me to look behind me. I hesitated. I turned my head slightly, but nothing was there in my office except dusty shelves and a dim lamp. When I looked back, the uniformed one was closer to the glass. He mouthed a single word that I couldn't interpret. Suddenly the mirror's surface flickered again, and all of them vanished. I was left staring at my own reflection, sweaty, fade and pale. My body felt drained, my legs wobbled, and I leaned on the desk. I stood there for a while, listening to my own breath echo in my ears. The mirror showed me exactly as I was, no more shifting images. I glanced at the door, making sure it was still locked, then looked back at my reflection. My eyes flicked over every detail, waiting to see if some other version of me would pop up. The surface stayed normal. I dragged my hands down my face, feeling stubble and damp skin. I realized I'd been in that office for over an hour, locked in a silent standoff with possible versions of my future self. They'd all seemed desperate to influence what I might do next. I had no idea which one to trust, or if trusting any of them was wise. My heart still pounded and my chest felt tight. I felt like I'd run a marathon even though I hadn't moved much. I covered the Mirror with the sheet again, my hand shook and my back HDHD from tension. I put the lamp away and grabbed my keys. On my way out, I glanced back at the sheet, half expecting it to fly off or show some outline behind it, but it stayed still. I locked up the office, locked up the shop, and stepped outside into the early night air. The sky was dark and I felt a cool breeze on my face. My shirt clung to my damp skin and I tasted salt on my lips from dried sweat. I climbed into my truck and sat there for a moment, letting my hands rest on the steering wheel. My mind replayed everything I'd seen. I felt like a giant puzzle was in front of me, but all the pieces were from different boxes. Finally, I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. I drove home in silence, not even been turning on the radio. My fingers tapped the wheel and my gaze stayed on the road, but my thoughts were locked on that mirror. I wondered if I'd see something else the next time I uncovered it. I wondered if I was supposed to choose which version of me would take over my future. They definitely seemed to be fighting each other. Maybe they needed my help. Maybe I had to pick one path. I wasn't sure if I wanted to, but I knew I wouldn't just toss the mirror in the trash. There was something about it that called to me, even if it scared the hell out of me. That night I got home and sat on my couch in the dark. My body was stiff and my head pounded. I turned on a lamp, stared at the blank wall across from me, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I needed a plan, but I had no clue how to make one. All I knew was that something impossible was happening, and it was in my possession. Part of me felt a spark of excitement, but mostly I just felt a cold dread in my chest. I decided to return to the shop at dawn and see if the mirror showed me anything new. I couldn't stand not knowing. I needed to see if they'd come back or if maybe I could find a way to communicate with them. I went to bed much later, tossed and turned for hours, and finally fell asleep. When I woke, I felt that same knot of anxiety in my gut. My arms felt heavy and my neck was stiff. I made some coffee, left it half finished, and drove to my shop. I reached the office, took the sheet off the mirror, and stood there bracing myself for more silent arguments, but this time the surface stayed ordinary. My reflection stared back with tired eyes. I leaned in, waiting. Nothing changed. It's been a week since then. The mirror hasn't shown me any more versions of myself, but every time I walk by I feel a jolt in my stomach. I can't bring myself to sell it or smash it. I keep thinking about those silent versions of me fighting to be seen, each one reaching out. Sometimes I wonder if they're lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to break through again. I haven't told anyone about it. It sounds insane, but I've noticed small things in my daily routine that match details I saw in those reflections, like a new jacket I felt tempted to buy or a ring I saw at a jeweler's. Now I hesitate every time I'm faced with a choice, wondering if it leads to one of those possible outcomes. I'm not sure which future is the right one. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to pick at all. All I know is that the mirror changed how I look at my own decisions. I can't shake the feeling that at any moment those reflections might burst through the haze again, pushing and shoving each other, all trying to convince me they're the one I should follow. And each time I think about that, I feel a tension in my chest that won't let up. The mirror is still in my office, covered by that old sheet, waiting, and I'm here stuck with all these questions and no clear answers. But every day when I open the shop I can't help but glance at that door to my office, half expecting to hear a silent fight breaking out on the other side of the glass. I never thought I would see tombstones shift position on their own. I used to roll my eyes at stories like that. Then I noticed something odd. One morning I had opened the cemetery gates just before sunrise, the same routine I'd been following for years, but when I took a quick look around, some of the headstones didn't seem to match the pattern I remembered, my first thought was that maybe I'd just forgotten the layout. I told myself I was imagining things, but the next night I stayed later than usual and I paid extra attention. It wasn't my imagination. I'll start from the beginning. My name is Henry and I've worked as a groundskeeper and gravedigger in this small cemetery for almost a decade. This place isn't very large and it sits on the edge of a quiet town. We don't get a lot of visitors, but occasionally people come by to visit old family plots. I maintain the grass, keep the walkways clear, and make sure everything looks decent. My job also includes digging new graves, though that doesn't happen very often. Most of my evenings end with me locking the main gate, checking the fences, and doing a final roll around the grounds. About 3 weeks ago something changed. One morning I stepped in to rake some leaves near the western edge of the cemetery. That section has some of the oldest tombstones, made of weathered stone with fading inscriptions. I glanced at the headstones to see if everything was in order right away. I had this gut feeling that something was off. The headstone seemed spaced differently, almost like some had shifted a few inches. It wasn't obvious at first, but I know that stretch of land very well. I see it every day. I know how close or far each stone should be to the tree line. I chalked it up to my memory playing tricks. I kept working, raking piles of leaves into small mounds, ignoring that weird feeling in my stomach. That night I finished my last walkthrough and lingered by the old graves. I used a flashlight to look at each headstone carefully. I remember the cold breeze on my face, the quiet sounds of the wind, and the rustle of nearby branches. I stood there for a while, shining my light across the row of tombstones. They looked normal, so I locked up and headed home, telling myself I was just overthinking everything. But the following morning I noticed fresh scuff marks in the dirt near a couple of those old stones. It looked like the kind of marks you get when something heavy scrapes over soft ground. I bent down to look closer. The earth seemed disturbed, like someone had dragged a small bench or large rock a few feet across the soil. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if some local kids had sneaked in, but there were no footprints. There was no trash, no signs of anyone having a party, just those strange marks. That's when I started paying more attention. Each day I'd come in, check the grounds, and make a mental note of each tombstone's position. Then at night I'd do another pass. After locking the gate I'd do one final inspection before going home. I started bringing a notebook with me. I'd jot down rough sketches of the rows, marking the shapes of the tombstones and their approximate positions. A week into this I couldn't deny it anymore. At least 4 or 5 stones were moving, not drastically, but enough to create gaps or different alignments. I noticed patterns in the way they were shifting. On some nights a few stones would move a couple of inches to the left. On other nights different stones would tilt slightly or slide forward. By the second week the movement had spread to more headstones, forming a strange cluster. I decided to stay in the cemetery overnight to see for myself. I brought a thermos of coffee, a small fold-out chair, and a flashlight. I positioned myself in an old storage shed that sits near the back fence, where I could see a clear view of the older section without drawing attention. The shed has a tiny window, and I kept the light off to avoid scaring away anyone if it was a person who might be messing around. I sat there for hours. My legs started cramping, and I felt the chill from the cold air seeping into my jacket. I remember hearing my own breath, the occasional rustle of leaves, and a distant dog barking around 2 a.m. I stepped out quietly and crept closer. My heart was pounding, and I could feel a layer of sweat forming on my forehead. Even though it was cold, I stared at the row of tombstones. Nothing moved. I forced myself to wait. I crouched behind a large granite headstone. The night was still. The moonlight gave me just enough visibility to see the shapes of the stones, but they were just silhouettes in the dim light. I must have stayed crouched there for at least an hour. My thighs burned from holding that position. Finally, I saw it. One of the tombstones at the far right edge seemed to shift a few inches in a single sudden motion. There wasn't a sound, it just moved. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my pulse racing. I wanted to stand up and run, but I forced myself to stay put. Then another tombstone about 10 feet away from the first tilted slightly and slid an inch or two. I gripped the top of the granite stone I was hiding behind, feeling the rough edges press into my palms. By the time it ended, maybe 4 or 5 of them had shifted into a new formation. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was so stunned that I almost forgot to take note of the exact positions. I tried to remember every detail, but I was shaking. When I finally stood up, my legs were numb. I turned on my flashlight and walked slowly among the tombstones that had moved. Their positions were different from a few hours earlier. That was beyond a doubt. The next morning I used my notes to create a map of the changes. I marked the new positions and compared them to the old ones I'd logged over the past couple of weeks. The shifts formed what looked like patterns, almost geometric shapes. They seemed to be pointing toward the far corner of the cemetery where there's an old granite mausoleum. I walked over there and checked the structure. The heavy iron gate on it was still locked. I examined the ground around it. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but when I circled around to the back, I noticed a loose patch of soil. It looked fresher than the surrounding dirt. Over the next few nights, I kept recording the movements each time the stones would rearrange themselves a little more, creating what looked like a partial path. Some tombstones ended up leaning in a direction that was clearly pointing toward the mausoleum. Others formed a curve that seemed to outline a boundary around that loose patch of soil. I started to suspect there was something buried there. I decided to do some digging, literal digging. One afternoon when nobody was around, I locked the gate behind me, grabbed a shovel and went to the spot behind the mausoleum. My muscles tensed when I pushed the shovel into the earth. Each scrape of the shovel against the dirt sounded too loud. My heart beat faster with every inch I dug. I didn't know what I'd find. I kept going until I reached about 3 foot down. The soil felt compacted in some places but loose in others. After about an hour, I struck something solid. At first I thought it might be a large rock, but as I brushed away the dirt, I saw it was made of wood, old and damp. I figured it could be a piece of a wooden crate or maybe a part of some old coffin, but there was no sign of remains or anything like that. It looked more like a box, rectangular and reinforced with iron bands. The wood was so decayed that parts of it flaked off. When I touched it, I leaned back on my heels and took a deep breath, feeling my heart thumping. I thought about what could be inside. I cleared the rest of the dirt around the box. It was maybe 3 foot long and about a foot wide. My gloves were caked with mud. I tried lifting it, but it was heavy. I managed to drag it out of the hole, straining my back. I laid it on the grass and brushed off the remaining soil. I noticed a faint set of symbols carved into the wood, but they were too worn to read properly. I checked the box for a latch. One of the iron bands looked like it could be pried open. Using the tip of the shovel and a bit of force, I managed to break the rotten wood near the band. The lid creaked and splintered. My hand shook. I felt a chill crawl down my arms and my breath felt tight. I lifted the lid. Inside there was a rolled up piece of old parchment and a small metal object wrapped in cloth. The object looked like a crude medallion, tarnished and scratched. It had some kind of design on it, but I couldn't make it out right then. I unrolled the parchment. It had a series of CRYP markings, almost like a rough map. Some lines and shapes corresponded roughly to the layout of the town, or at least that's what I guessed there were No labels in English, just strange symbols and a small drawing that resembled a hill or a mound with a symbol over it. Maybe it was some old clue pointing to a bigger treasure or something else buried long ago. My hands were covered in dirt and I was crouched there sweating. Even though it wasn't hot out, I heard a rustling near the main path. I froze. I felt a spike of adrenaline shoot through my veins. I worried that someone would find me digging back here. My mind raced. If I got caught, how would I explain myself? I closed the lid, shoved the parchment and the medallion into my jacket pockets and pushed the box aside. I quickly filled the hole back in, trying to make it look undisturbed. Then I tucked the box behind the Mulholland wall. For the time being, I scurried around front, leaning my shovel against the building. I saw a grounds crew truck pass by outside, but nobody came in. My hands shook as I realized I was onto something. The tombstones had been moving to guide me here, or at least that's what I believed. Over the next few days I studied the parchment whenever I had a moment alone. The design on the medallion was hard to make out, so I tried cleaning it with a soft cloth and some water. Under the layers of grime I saw an etched symbol that resembled a circle inside a triangle. It felt strange to hold that piece of metal. I kept thinking about the tombstones shifting night after night. It all seemed connected, but I didn't know how. I continued to watch the cemetery. At night the tombstones would still move, but now they were rearranging into shapes that looked more elaborate. I'd see them aligned in arcs, almost forming partial circles. My chest would tighten whenever I witnessed it happen. Sometimes I thought I heard a faint grinding or scraping, but it was always quick. Then everything would be still again. At one point I tried to show my notes to a colleague who occasionally helps with maintenance. He gave me a confused look and asked if I was okay. I realized I must have sounded crazy talking about moving tombstones and hidden boxes. I decided it was better to keep my mouth shut and deal with this alone. I kept the parchment and the medallion locked in a drawer at my place. I tried matching the symbols on the parchment with an old map of the town I found in the public library. Certain lines seemed to match the contours of the land around the cemetery. The center of the parchment drawing lined up with the cemetery itself. There was another smaller mark that could correspond to a nearby hill. I wondered if there was another buried item out there. The thought made me uneasy. I felt this compulsion to check that spot, but I also felt a knot in my stomach whenever I thought about going alone to some random hill with a shovel. The boxes in my mind felt heavier every day. Meanwhile, the tombstones kept shifting. I noticed that they seemed to be forming an arrow-like pattern pointing outside the cemetery, almost directing me to continue my search. I wasn't sure I wanted to follow it, but I also felt a kind of obsession, like I needed to see this through. One evening I grabbed a flashlight and hiked a short distance to that hill indicated on the library map. I found a little clearing with the same shape as the one on the parchment. The ground felt harder there, and I didn't see any sign of fresh dirt or old markings. I pressed my foot on the grass, scanning around with my flashlight. My shoulders were tense, my heart thumped in my chest. I heard the wind whistling through nearby trees, and the darkness around me felt oppressive, but I didn't see any direct sign of a hidden box or anything like that. I returned to the cemetery that night, my mind spinning with questions. The tombstones had moved again, creating a new formation that lined up with the main walkway. My flashlight revealed tracks in the dirt, those same drag marks. I walked along the path, shining the beam on each stone. My muscles were tight, and I could feel the strain in my neck. I stopped at the foot of one large headstone that had shifted at least 6 in from where it had been the previous morning. I ran my hand over the stone surface. It was cold and rough to the touch. That's when I noticed a faint inscription near the base that I'd never seen before. It wasn't an ordinary name or date, it matched a symbol I'd seen on the parchment, a small circle inside a triangle. I felt a jolt of excitement flood my body, my palms got sweaty, and I realized I was holding my breath. I rubbed my eyes, checking the symbol again. It was real, this had to be connected to the map. And the medallion, the tombstones were communicating something, or they were controlled by something that wanted me to follow these clues. I glanced around at the stillness. The cemetery was silent, but my heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I'm still here, working the same job, going through the same routines by day, by night. I remain on edge. I've learned to accept that the headstones are moving. I can't explain how or why, but I see it, I feel it. Each shift seems to lead me closer to whatever secret was buried centuries ago. The box behind the mum, the parchment, the medallion, and that strange symbol, they're all part of something bigger than me, and I can't walk away from it. Now I keep my flashlight, my shovel, and the map in my car ready for the moment the pattern becomes clear enough to show me exactly where to dig next. Every time I look at the old stones, I feel a prickle at the back of my neck. My pulse quickens. I scan the ground, noticing fresh marks. I question my own sanity, but I also know what I've seen. Tombstones shouldn't move on their own, yet they do, and they're not done moving, not by a long shot. They're guiding me to something that's been hidden in this ground for ages. I've made peace with the fact that this secret isn't going to stay underground much longer. At this point, I'm just waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to slide into place. Tomorrow morning I'll check the rows again. I'll record every position change and see how the new pattern looks. I don't know how far this will go, but I do know one thing: those tombstones aren't finished sending me messages, and I plan to keep watching until I find exactly what they're trying to show me. It all started on a Monday night around 3 weeks ago when I was working the last shift at the Harrison Street station. I'd been assigned to that shift for a few months, and I liked the quiet atmosphere. After 11 p.m. my job was to walk the platforms, check the equipment, and make sure nobody was hanging around. After closing, I usually locked up the side entrances by 11:30 p.m. then stayed in the small booth on the main platform until the last train rolled through just before midnight. After that, I'd count the tickets from the vending machines and clean up any trash people left behind. It was a routine I knew inside out, but that night something happened that completely broke my sense of normal. At exactly midnight, I was leaning against the booth, half asleep, when I heard a faint rattling sound coming from the tunnel. It didn't sound like the usual squeaks or hums from the cooling vents. It was heavier, like a real train that shouldn't be there at that hour. I stepped out of the booth and looked down on the dark tunnel. The overhead lights in the tunnel were dim, just enough to help maintenance crews see if they ever walked down there. I leaned forward and strained my eyes. Then I saw headlights. They weren't blinding or anything. They were a dull yellow, flickering slightly, like they weren't getting steady electricity. My heart pounded because I knew the official last train had come and gone. There was no reason for any train to be passing through at that time. I told myself it might be a special maintenance train. I grabbed my radio and pressed the talk button. I tried to call the control center, but all I got was static. I shook the radio once, thinking maybe the battery was loose, and I tried again, still nothing. Then I heard the squeal of brakes on the track. It's hard to describe the feeling I had. Right then the hair on my arm stood up, my mouth went dry, my thoughts raced. I remember thinking, this can't be real. They would have told me if a maintenance train was scheduled. But I saw it rolling in, steel wheels grinding, slowing to a stop right at the platform. I watched as the doors slid open, the overhead lights flickered and I noticed that the side of the train looked old. It had scratches and rust spots that don't match our current fleet. Our trains get regular paint jobs. This one looked neglected. I hesitated for a second and stepped forward. The doors stayed open and I stared into the empty space. Then I saw people inside. At first I didn't recognize them. They sat there mostly silent, some of them looking in my direction. Something about their faces looked off, like they'd been through a lot. A few seconds later I recognized a woman who usually rides in the afternoon. She's a clerk who works in an office building a few blocks away, but this woman on the train had wrinkles and graying hair. She looked older by at least 10 years, maybe more. Her clothes looked modern though not outdated. Another man sitting across from her reminded me of my neighbor from up the street. He had the same facial structure, but his hair was thin and he had heavy lines under his eyes. I felt my chest tighten. My mind started rejecting what I was seeing. I kept thinking, this can't be them. This must be some weird trick of the light. But as I turned my head to look for another passenger, I caught sight of a reflection in the glass. I saw my own face, but older, at least a decade older. I had thicker stubble, more lines on my forehead, and my hair was thinner around the temples. I looked worn out, like I'd been through some tough times. In that moment my throat went tight and I felt sweat gather on my back. I froze. I wasn't sure if I should step onto the train or run. My heart was pounding. I couldn't hear anything except the hum of the lights and the slight hiss coming from the train's open doors. Eventually I forced myself to turn away and check the platform, hoping someone else had seen this. I didn't see anyone. The station was empty and silent. When I looked back, the doors were still open. My hand shook a little and I bit my lip. I took a few steps closer, but then the door slid shut. The train started moving, picking up speed unnaturally fast. In a matter of seconds it disappeared into the far tunnel. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to gather my thoughts. Then I checked the clock on the wall. It said 12:10 a.m. I walked back to my booth in a daze. I tried my radio again. This time it connected. I asked the control center if there was any late night work happening. They said no, everything was clear. I told them I thought I saw train, but they said the system log showed no movement. I thought about telling them more, but I decided it wouldn't sound believable. I ended the call and sat down in my chair. My leg bounced up and down and my breath felt shallow. I had a dozen questions in my head. I knew I'd be there the next night, so I decided to wait and see if it returned. The next night I went through my shift as usual, but I kept glancing at the clock every few minutes. By 11:55 p.m. I was standing on the platform staring down the tunnel. Everything was quiet again. I pressed my lips together, feeling nervous. Then it happened. Right at midnight I heard the familiar rattle. The lights in the tunnel seemed to dim as the train appeared. It was the same old car. With that same dull flicker, I felt a jolt in my stomach. My palms got clammy and I realized I was gripping my flashlight so hard my knuckles hurt. When the train stopped and the doors opened, like and subscribe for 4